What is up, everybody? Patrick Connor here, and welcome to the Knuckles and Gloves podcast. We got some light heavyweight action this weekend, and today I'm here with my boy Aris Pina, Compubox operator and history dude. What's up, Aris? How you doing, man?
What's going on, my man?
I'm excited for the fight this weekend, dude. Like boxing has fallen to this place where we cannot reliably presume that like the best are going to fight the best regularly. There's all sorts of corners that fighters can hide these days. One of the fights that needed to happen in boxing was Artur Beterbiev versus Dmitry Bivol. Finally, after postponements, ideas going up in smoke, fucking all sorts of crazy shit happening. Finally, the fight is happening this weekend. So that's what we're here to talk about. But we're also going to be dragging on to talk about some other light heavyweights, man.
Most definitely, bro. The light heavyweight division is one of the most deepest and long reigning in boxing, going back all the way to like the early 1900s when Jack Root, I believe it was, became the inaugural champion. Um, so soon after that, I mean, we've had absolute legendary fighters become champion of that division. You know what I mean? From the likes of Archie Moore, you had Ezra Charles, who not was well, unfortunately wasn't champion because of the circumstances, but still recognized as maybe the greatest of all time in that division. You had Bob Foster. Later on in life, in the careers, you had Roy Jones. Like, there's just been an incredible amount of fighters, and like during the golden age of the late 70s up into the 80s, it was one of the best divisions in the history of boxing in that terms of that era. So I mean, the light heavyweight division just has tons of reference in history. That being said, ever since Bob Foster retired, which was around 1975, right? 74, 75.
Yeah,
I
he
mean, initially
relinquished it in like
retired. Yeah,
74, I think.
when he relinquished the title around 74, 75, the light heavyweight division and the titles at least have never really been unified like that. You know what I mean? They've more or less always been splintered. Except for a couple of occasions, like the time when you had initially when Dwight Muhammad Cowie and Michael Spinks got together and they unified it, and that became undisputed for a while. But then when Spinks moved back up, when Spinks drops the belts and moved up to heavyweight, then it became splintered again. And it's never really, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's never really been unified again since then, right? Roy Jones was undisputed and more or less considered the man at light heavyweight, but he wasn't really the undisputed champion because, I think it was that Daruj Mekachevsky at the time was like the lineal champion, no?
I think what happened was I'd have to double check just to make sure, but I
Yeah.
think what happened was Virgil Hill unified, and when Virgil Hill unified, that was considered kind of like a creating like a new line or whatever. However, that was like more than 10 years between Michael Spinks vacating
Mhm.
and basically leaving the lineal title or whatever vacant, and then Virgil Hill unifying. But if I'm not mistaken, he either dropped or he either vacated or got stripped of one of the titles. And then so that's splintered everything again. But then Mikolchevsky defeated Virgil Hill and he picked up the lineal title or whatever. And that's when it got extremely messy because that was precisely when Roy Jones entered the equation and started unifying. So a lot of people, especially in the US, considered Roy Jones the true light heavyweight champion. But in terms of lineal champions, then it was Darius Mikolczewski, and then by shock, Julio Cesar Gonzalez and Zoltar
Yeah.
Day, etc. So anyway, yeah, but that it required a long ass stupid explanation is the point, and it did shouldn't. It should be like this was a champion and then this was a champ. But that's kind of what I opened up saying is that it's we can't reliably expect that these things will be the case anymore for a host of reasons. So I
Sure.
mean, a lot of guys
So,
get lost in the shuffle.
so depending on how you look at it and depending on how you look at the light heavyweight lineage, because like you just mentioned, that can go any different way and people can have different perspectives on how they want to go about that. But if you want to look at it truly, this might be the first fight when I'm talking about Bivol Beterbiev, where we have a first true undisputed champion since Spinks and Cowie back in like what 1983. So we're talking 41 years now. I mean 40, yeah, 41 years now, and
Jesus
that's
Christ.
incredible. That's absolutely incredible. And this is a massive fight. I mean, for what it is, like it's not like massive all over the world because these are two guys from different countries that even though they've had an impact on U.S. television and, been champions for such a long time, and both of them have major wins, it's the fact that like they're not just major stars, like overall crossover stars, because there's very few of those in boxing. But in terms of just being one of the biggest fights in boxing, just for the sport in general, you can't get any better than this.
It's really it's fairly rare that you get a fight between two fighters who are pretty close to their prime, both undefeated, and then also both have, for the most part, pretty pleasing styles, and it's a fight that should happen. And
Mm.
there's a lot of planets aligning for this fight in the sense that it's the correct fight. It's the fight that most people in boxing want to see, etc. It's a meaningful fight. And so I don't want to say we're spoiled or anything like that because it's kind of taken a bit for this fight to really come to fruition. And we'll get to some of the other particulars in just a moment. But there are some other factors, in my opinion, involved that kind of knock it down a peg. It could be a little bit better, it could be a little bit different, but I'm not going to complain. I'm certainly not going to complain about the fight, but I do wish it had taken place perhaps a little bit earlier.
Absolutely. I mean, we always talk about marination and kind of joke about that when it comes to boxing and stuff, but it is true. Some fights that if you wait too long and they die on the vine. Look at the most recent one, or it looks like it might be this way, with which has happened with Tyson Fury and well, not Fury, excuse me, with Wilder and Joshua.
Well,
You
I
know,
mean, it
people,
could be Fury Joshua too, in a way. You know
yeah,
what I
yeah,
mean?
yeah, yeah,
That
absolutely.
that could apply too.
Because Totally. So we got these type of fights that like, people were clamoring, especially back when both of them were champion, that it should have happened. Both of them were at their peak. Neither one of them had lost at that time, and neither had sustained like major damage to the point where you just knew it could have been explosive. But with Wilder being starched a bunch of time, a couple few times since then, just looking like an absolute spent bullet. And Joshua looking as shaky as he did when Dubois just bludgeoned him in his last fight. I mean, sure, it can still happen, but like that's one of those fights that you just kind of waited too long for it to happen. Look at the one that everyone's always jokes about. Which one was it? Wanma against Gamboa.
I
Yuriorkis
was just
Gamboa.
about to fucking bring that
Yeah,
up, dude, because that
you know,
shit that shit was a punchline for like a fucking 3 years straight. Yeah.
sure, sure. And I mean, it was ridiculous too because they both fought on HBO. They were both with Top Rank. They're both in the same division, and they were both just like it was just they were featured together all the time on the same card. Like, it was just talked about. The fact that that fight never got made and it never got in, until Wanma just got burnt out and then Gamboa went on his own route, it was like absurd. And still to this day, it makes absolutely no sense that that fight never got made.
Yeah, or Adonis Stevenson versus Sergey Kovalev. That's another one that like we were like so fucking close and
Yeah.
just stupid ass politics and a host of other idiots. Fucking
Mayweather Pacquiao, look how many years that took before it finally happened. And that was years too late to a degree.
yeah. I mean, I'm happy that it happened at all, but at the same time, yeah, dude. And well, I mean, just getting right straight to the Beterbiev versus Bivol discussion. I think that's a lot of what we're looking at right here. Artur Beterbiev, dude, he turned pro more than 10 years ago. He only has
Mm.
20 fights. And I mean, I'm not blaming him at all. It's funny. And we talked about this last week when we brought up Montreal as a fucking boxing city and as a place where that is kind of really birthed a number of stars, and even fighters who are not from the city have become, and also Quebec too, Quebec City,
Mm.
have been able to become big stars in this area, because they're really dedicated boxing fans, and there are a handful of promoters around the area that are very protective of their fighters. And I don't mean protective in the bad sense. I mean protective in the sense that they pull for their fighters and they're, batting for their fighters. However, whenever I've been critical even a little bit on social media of their fighters, I usually get multitudes of people jumping into my replies going like, "What the fuck?" I'm like, I'm not trying to shit on Beterbiev at all. On the contrary, it's frustrating to me because it's extremely clear that he's a really, really good fighter, and we've only been able to see him as a professional 20 times, dude. He's got 98 rounds 98 rounds over the course of like almost 12 years as a professional. And in a lot of ways, that's good. I don't want him to take damage. I don't want him to get hurt. I don't want anybody getting injured. So in a lot of ways, that's good. And it seems almost kind of paradoxical that I'd be complaining about it. But in the sense that like we haven't gotten as many good looks on him. We don't really know what he looks like right now. Like he's only fought once a year over the last couple of years, and this is the first year in a while where he will have fought twice on the calendar year, and even then it got postponed because he got injured. That definitely concerns me. I think that at almost any other time we'd be looking at this fight and we'd be like, yeah, Bivol, he beat like Canelo, and that's probably for right now, at least in terms of the timing and all that type of stuff, his most notable win. And so Beterbiev is probably going to smush him. But because of the timing and because of the injuries and all that inactivity, it's kind of like, I don't know. Like there's a couple moments in his last few fights where he's looked a little shaky, and we've been like, ugh, I don't know. So it's tough to say.
I mean, this is what makes this such a compelling fight. It really is a pick'em fight, you know. Beterbiev has looked like such an absolute anvil. Well, I mean, he's 20-0 with 20 knockouts, so it's like proof is in the pudding right there. But like you just said, Pat, he's also suffered a lot of injuries. You know what I mean? It had a lot of stops and starts with his career because of it. He's been a pro for over 10 years, but at the same time, it's like 20 fights in 11 years is not very active. And he's not, yeah, I mean, what's his age now right now?
He's like 39.
Yeah, he's not a young guy, and he had an extensive amateur career before this that we kind of mentioned. So he's been around for a minute. Like, there's gonna come a time when his body just kind of falls apart, and we'll find out if he's like fully recovered from, what was the injury that he just had.
Dude, I want to say before he had like a lingering back injury, and I don't know
Mhm.
what it was that postponed it this time. I think a hand injury or an arm injury or something, but like, regardless, it's,
Yeah.
notable injuries here.
Totally. And to come in with like, lingering injuries and just maybe not the same that he used to be against a guy like Bivol, who the way he's built, the way he can move, the way he boxes, the way he just, his overall being and stuff like that is like not an easy task. But if anybody can do it, it's a guy like Beterbiev because not only does he hit like an absolute anvil and can destroy you, but like it's the way he sets his punches up. He's not just a little waiting slug or anything. Like he's really efficient, you know. Cl really, really clinically efficient. The way he comes in really slow and he jabs his way in and he finds openings and the way he can loop his shots over and still touch you and all that. And his defense has always been sound. He comes in from a mini crouch, like awful type of guy to fight. Kind of similar in the way of like Cowie, except he's more, of a heavy hitter than Cowie was. And better overall boxer, I would say. But like Beterbiev is just, it's a great fight. All right. I've been struggling back and forth to have like a clear winner on it. I'm slightly leaning toward Bivol only because of the injuries and the age of Beterbiev, not so much because I think Bivol's a better overall fighter. So
And
that's
that's honestly what it comes down to a lot for me is like just looking real quick because I don't want to be a fucking liar because I wanted to see what kind of injuries he's had. I mean, dude, he's had some serious shit. He's had it looks like more than one shoulder surgery. He had to have plastic surgery for the cut that he had on his forehead.
that was a
He
nasty one. I remember that.
real bad, a fucking torn meniscus or a ruptured meniscus. Dude, I tore my meniscus when I was 18 and like when I was fucking in the gym, like I didn't do it in the gym, but when I was actually actively going to the gym, never the same ever. Never the same after that. And granted, I was not then or I am not now a fucking high level athlete. So with high
Come
level
on, Pat.
athletes probably recover way better.
We know you're going to become a national Golden Gloves champion. What are we talking about?
I was a fucking monster. No, but like,
Could have been a
I,
contender.
I could have been nobody, but fucking, I'm sure, high level athletes recover differently and better. I'm sure.
Yeah.
However, that's serious shit. But I guess since we're here, and might as well just fucking bring it up because why not? It's going to be part of the pre-fight discussion regardless, and it is on social media. Dmitry Bivol has also been accused
Mhm.
lately by his, I think, estranged wife, either
Yeah.
ex-wife or estranged wife, of abuse, of assault, and not fucking cool. I mean, I don't know the details. I'm not really
There was
interested in knowing the details, but it sounds like she's got video of the guy being a total fucking dickhead. So that just kind of gives you, it makes it complicated, because I'm
Yeah.
leaning towards Bivol like you, because a lot of the injuries, the inactivity, it's fair to also say Bivol, he's like, I think 9 or 10 years deep on his pro career, and he's only fought like 25 times or something like that. So it's not like he's been super active. However, he's also 33 and he's a little bit younger. He also had an extensive amateur career too. So it's almost kind of like he's got a little bit of a head start in terms of activity on Beterbiev, perhaps fewer injuries, etc. But the outside the ring stuff, there are going to be people who say, don't worry about that. I don't listen to any of that stuff. I do worry about it. I do listen to that stuff. And I don't like when fucking athletes do that. Athletes or non athletes. And frankly, it just gives me a reason to root against this person in life, not to mention the fucking fight. So that complicates things, but it's not going to change who I believe is going to win. It certainly could change who I root for, though.
I mean, 1,000%. Like, there's actually been a couple of videos that did surface online, not of Bivol hitting his wife or his estranged wife or anything like
Right.
that.
Yeah. I'm not trying to like make weird accusations, but he's a
No,
dick.
no, 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 no. He's an absolute dick. Like, no, if what was being interpreted was true, I it was a few weeks ago when I saw the video already, but like it said something to the it was some nasty stuff he said to her while they were arguing, and his kid and one of their kids was there witnessing it too. And it was just
Yeah.
like,
Telling her
he
like
was,
go murk herself and stuff like that.
yeah, 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 yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Like, go kill yourself or go run and track, go do something like to that effect. And it was bad. And like you said, you know what I mean? Like, that's not going to change who I think is going to win, but that can definitely change who you're rooting for in a fight like this because it's been throughout in boxing history. There's been a lot of guys that have been into a lot of bad shit, a lot of abusers, and a lot of people have done that crazy things when you can go all the way back to
Right,
like
dude. We're the wrong people to be like, well, what about so and so? That
yeah,
we've already done the true crime fucking shit, and we know that's not the point. Bad
yeah,
is bad.
1,000%. And so that being said, it's just, I don't know, hopefully Bivol sees not what am I trying to say? Oh, like hopefully Beevil gets like, like karma for whatever endeavors he was doing outside of there, whether it's going to be through the court system or this and that. But like when it comes to this fight, it's going to be tough, man. I mean, I can see Beevil outbox him. I saw a couple of people trying to say online that they can see him winning like 116 or 117, 111. I don't see that happening. Like unless Beterbiev is completely broken down and just going through the motions and in a shell of himself, he's not going to allow a fight like that to be like that. Dude puts too much pressure on you and does too much for you to allow yourself to like, even if he can get hit early on and you might think you have an advantage when you try to go with him, like eventually that shit catches up to you. You know what I mean? It's like a rolling ball, like the one in Indiana Jones from one.
Raiders of the Lost Ark. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You know what I mean? When it just keeps on coming and coming and shit, it's gonna eventually roll over you. And it's like Bivol has taken punishment before, but he's also been hurt before. We saw him get hurt against Joe Smith, I believe it was, right?
Mm.
And we've seen him tag before and other guys too. Like Canelo was able to put hands on him, even though it got outboxed. But think about all the times Canelo was hitting him on his arm still and doing the same, club and shit, right? A guy like Beterbiev will do the same thing, but he hits 10 times harder than Canelo does. So is Bivol going to be able to
Yeah.
hold up for that for 12 rounds?
That's just it's what adds to the intrigue. Beterbiev is clearly one of the biggest punchers, pound for pound in the sport right now, and he's the kind of guy who could put you to sleep if you're not careful. If you think you're out ahead, and he can get inactive in the ring too. He can kind of his I don't have any Compubox stats in front of me, but I would imagine if you looked at him, he'd probably be on the lower side, and he's efficient. He's
Sure.
not wasting a whole lot of energy, and that's good, but that also, in the meanwhile, it can lose you rounds. But he has the kind of punching power coupled with the proper technique and delivery system that can put your lights out, is the problem. And so you give Artur Beterbiev the same kind of opportunities as, for instance, Canelo had, or even Joe Smith had against Dmitry Bivol. That could be nap time, bro. I mean, it could be fucking night night. But again, just adds to the intrigue. I mean, what are you thinking? Like you kind of just leaning Bivol, but it's tough, or where are you going?
Yeah, honestly, I'm leaning toward Beevil, but if you told me to put money on it, it would just be a minimal amount. I don't know. Like I just don't feel that comfortable on it. And that's the beauty of a fight like this. When you have two guys in the same division finally gonna fight each other. And it's one of those 50-50 fights where you really can't like lean one way seriously to the other. Yeah, like that makes the best ones. But I'm leaning toward Bivol by like decision and a close decision at that. But it's gonna be tough. If better be if like grinds him down and stops him, I would not be surprised in the least. I think the most surprised I would be if like somebody gets blown out, which I don't think is gonna happen either way.
Yeah, so looking just at a couple lines on the fight just to see what it looks like overall. I'm not nobody's paying me, so I'm not naming any fucking website names, motherfuckers. But it looks like roughly it looks like about minus 150 for Dmitry Bivol, roughly across the board, minus 130, minus 150, minus 150. So that makes him a slight favorite. Like, yeah, you bet $150 to win 100. Something like that. I don't know. It's
I
they
don't know about
fucking
that.
they
Not even
interpret
work.
it weird, and I'm not a fucking betting person. All I know is that that makes him a clear favorite, but not a big favorite whatsoever, like 5-4 or something like that. But nonetheless, looks like Bivol's a favorite. Kind of like how we're going, dude. A slight favorite, slight edge to Bivol. I mean, it's nothing definitive. Nobody, no hot takes or anything like that. Like you're gonna get fucking knocked out. No, dude. I don't know. It's a close fight. It looks like it's a competitive fight on paper. There are a number of different things that can happen given the variables that we have. Uh, Artur Beterbiev's injuries and activity, Dmitry Bivol getting hurt in a couple different fights. Don't know, but yeah, I think I'm going with you. Bivol probably by decision, but maybe even a disputed decision.
I just hope for a really great fight. Like if it matches up on paper, then sometimes we've seen it where like it's gonna be a can't miss, and then it ends up being a dud somehow, or it just the styles don't mesh well or whatever it may be. But I think we're gonna get something special this Saturday. I'm working it, so I'm just can't wait in general.
Yeah, dude, it should be the kind of fight where right when it's starting there should be a fair amount of tension. Wish it could have a better support and undercard, but you could literally say that about like any bigger fight like these days in general. It's just how it is. I hope everything goes swimmingly in Riyadh.
I mean, it's another one too there when you think about it. This is one of those fights that as much as we've talked shit about Turkey like jokingly or whatever it may be, and it rightfully so, but this is one of those fights that even though they're two of the best fighters in the world, their profiles aren't big enough to bring them together for the money that they wanted. You know what I
No,
mean?
that's
Like by the
fair.
end.
No, you're right.
So Turkey is one of those guys that comes around and has that type of stuff for it, and this is perfect for his platform. So they have the money that make these type of fights. So in that regard, I'm thankful for it.
From a fan perspective, yeah, like who gives a shit where the money's coming from, who's paying for it, whatever. All I know is I'm benefiting from it as a fan.
Sure.
And uh, yeah, like from that perspective, 100%. And also, yeah, you got to give him credit, dude, because he did step up. And even though I think that a couple of the fights he was aiming for were kind of misguided in terms
Million.
of what
Yeah.
he thought the fans wanted to see was not really what the fans wanted to see, but he was correct on this one, 100%.
Yeah. Sure. And he was the one that had enough money to make it happen, whereas opposed other promoters wouldn't think of it like, on their own to try to make it because the money that these guys would want for a fight that they know wouldn't be able to guarantee wherever they'd be able to
Right.
put it is different. You know what I mean? So
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. Hey, dude, fucking HBO turned down the opportunity at fucking Rafa Marquez versus Israel Vasquez. They were like, you're
Did
asking too much money. And it went to Showtime.
I feel like they did that with a couple other fights too in the past. And I don't remember which ones.
It's like, and that was one of those sort of can't miss styles and fights where fans were like, excuse what? Why? But it was, and from an economic perspective, I'm not saying I agree with it. I'm not excusing it whatsoever. But there's a finite amount of money that is allocated for certain fights. And if it's not considered a mega fight, or if there's nothing, that you can nothing that you can use to justify putting on, just throwing money at these fighters. 100% they agreed a million, or they deserved $1 million a piece. Of course they fucking did, but they weren't prepared to pay him what they were
Sure.
deserving. So that's why it was like, well, what the fuck are we doing here? But in this regard, yeah, dude, there are fights that miss the mark, or there are fights that can't be made or don't get made. This one got made. Got to give Turkey some credit, bro.
Sure. And I mean, I couldn't tell you much about the undercard. I'm just working it, nor do I'm really paying attention to it. But like, this is one of the biggest fights to be made in boxing. People have been hardcore fans and fans in general of the sport. It's been clamoring for it for a number of years. It's one of the best fights to be made in the sport because literally you're taking two of the best guys and look at their records, absolute pristine. And if you look at the guys they fought, same thing. They've cleaned out the division more or less. And this is it. Like Kenny Loggins said, right? This is it. I think that was Kenny Loggins, right?
Sounds about yeah, it sounds got that kind of Kenny Loggins type of this is it. Yeah,
Yeah, that's Kenny Loggins.
I'm
Michael
sure.
Spinks, speaking of light heavyweights, Michael Spinks used to walk out to that. That's actually a pretty badass ring walk song. You know, like it
That fits the
starts out
time
and
for
everything.
sure.
Yeah, definitely with the 80s.
I could come out some fucking Kenny Loggins shit, dude.
Yeah. Because like I remember like Spinks would come out and then you would like, like Butch Lewis and then would get and all of a sudden, this is it. Da, 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 this is it. And then you would see Spinks walk in, everyone kind of bopped.
Usually Leon trailing with him. If they could find him, if they could peel him out of some hotel room, they could get Leon. You not even
Sure.
work the corner, but just carry the belt or something.
You would just be there. Yeah, yeah. But yeah, bro, I mean, this is going to be a great fight. Like after this one, the winner of this fight will go higher up in the mythical pound for pound ratings and I'm sure will um the winner of the fight too will give an idea where Canelo's going to go from it. If Bivol wins the rematch, I think Canelo will try to jump back up to light heavyweight for that. If Beterbiev wins, and if he wins very dominantly, I'm not sure if Canelo's going to be that joyous to jump up to light heavyweight. Maybe he will. He's the type of guy that likes challenges, but Bivol's the guy he really wants is because that's the one that beat him. You know what I mean? So we'll see where everything goes after this.
And
All I know is that we're only a couple of days away.
the best case scenario for Canelo too would be that they beat each other up, soften each other up, and
Sure.
whoever wins kind of gets beaten up a little bit, and whether it's an emphatic win or not. So then that way he could be like, "Hey, fucking, let's fight 9 months from now," and then fucking, then the winner's 9 months fucking older, and he gets to hopefully beat the winner up. But I think that would probably be an ideal scenario for him. And it seems like the way that Canelo's been taking a point or opponents lately, that he's waiting for something. And I don't blame him because he's starting to get to an age and has fought enough now that I would imagine that he probably sees the light at the end of the fucking tunnel here. So it would make sense that he's trying to kind of set himself up for something like that. But yeah, we'll have to see who wins this weekend because if it's an emphatic win, like you said, like if Beterbiev, like, fucking puts Bivol to sleep in like round two or something like that, I think Canelo's going to be like, super middleweight's good. Yeah, I
Yeah,
like super
sure.
middleweight. 168. I like that. It's a good number.
Mhm. Absolutely, I could see that. That's what I was just like kind of alluding to. Depends on who's going to win the fight and how emphatic that the person wins it. I think if Bivol wins it regardless, Canelo is going to be enticed to jump back up.
Yeah.
But if Bivol wins and he looks like 1986 Mike Tyson in the process, then probably not.
Yeah. Canelo's spiteful and petty, and he wants that fucking get back. So I get it, but we'll see. But all right. So we got light heavyweights this weekend, but we're also, we've done a few kind of light heavyweight shows in the past. Sure, there's going to be some repetition, but it's probably been like 2 years or more since we've done anything like this. So who gives a shit whether we repeat anything? Doesn't really matter. We're here to talk about some more light heavyweights, bro. So, I mean, I think that what we're kind of aiming for is maybe unsung, underrated, forgotten, whatever you want to call it, light heavyweights of yesteryear. So, in other words, the ones that we probably would not have been mainstream talking about in the history, sense on past shows. So, who we got?
Um, all right, hold on one second as I bring up his record just to make sure. Because it's such a common name sometimes. I just want to make sure that if you type it in the box rec, you're gonna get like 400 entries of the same name, right? But one dude I always wanted to talk about, I don't think we've ever really talked about him on the show aside from him fighting James Toney is Prince Charles Williams, who was a pretty dominant light heavyweight champion from around 1987 up until the early 90s. Never really gets talked about today. I'm not going to say he's a guy that should be on a Hall of Fame ballot or anything like that, but just a dude who was really underrated and overall a tough as nails guy, and he had a badass Jerry curl back in the day too.
Yeah, dude. We were kind of briefly talking about it a little before the show, officially started, and it's funny because the massive shipments of fucking magazines that I've gotten lately, flipping through them in like the late '80s and early '90s. Charles Williams is a name that comes up a lot more, and there's other names too, but like almost there's like these little kind of forgotten slices of history or forgotten little eras or whatever where when you look through the magazines you're like, damn, they were really focused on some of these fighters who we never fucking talk about these days, and Charles Williams was one of them. He got a lot of features in magazines in the late '80s and early '90s.
I mean, Williams was one of those guys that kind of fell under the radar because he was part of the light heavyweight division, just like the middleweight division. When a major star kind of was there for a number of years, and then when they leave, you're trying to look for another person after that to take over, and it's kind of like you're in limbo. For instance, with the middleweights, after Marvin Hagler retired, it looked initially like they were going to have someone like Michael Alajade because of his personality. Dude was a model and his looks and the whole 9 yards and all that. And then he fights Frank Tate, who was an '84 Olympian, I think gold medalist in fact, but at the same time, a lower profile than a guy like Alajade. Frank Tate beats him, and then middleweight, in general like that, right? And so like think about the light heavyweights. Michael Spinks, who was never really a superstar, but still the dominant champion for so many years in that division, he moves up to challenge Larry Holmes. And that kind of leaves the light heavyweight division of that time kind of like, in a rut for a moment. Like you had dudes coming up like Leslie Stewart, Marvin Johnson, who I'm sure we'll bring up again, was still around, and a few other guys trying to fight for anything. And during that time, I would guess the first person that showed that he could have like star potential was Bobby Ches. You know what I mean? Bobby Ches was already known for television for a number of years. He was a part of the Tomorrow's Champions back in 1980 with like a group of other, top level fighters promoted by main events. Dude was behind them and featured on network television all the time. So by the time like 1986 or so rolled around, Ches had been around for a minute. His story had been known, like the tragedy he had gone through with his dad and other stuff. And he had some ups and downs in his career too. Like he had already lost to Mustafa Hamsho. He had suffered like some hand injuries and other stuff. And when he was a middleweight, now he's a light heavyweight and a veteran, as opposed to just being like a young, boyish looking dude plowing through guys. He gets a title shot. Who did he beat? Slabodan Kakar, I believe it was, right? And
Yeah, Kachar, yeah, I believe.
however you want to pronounce it, but he stops him, and I guess Ches would be the first guy that would show like star potential because he was featured all the time in magazines, and now that he's a champion with his backstory, like he was a dude who would get a lot of attention, so he can be like the first star. I would assume since Michael Spinks, but then after he loses to Prince Charles Williams, it kind of puts the light heavyweight division back in like a tailspin again because well, as good as Williams was, he didn't have like the matinee idol or like the story of a guy like Ches. Or I hate to say it, the complexion.
I'm not even going to lie to you. I got to look because I'm not entirely sure who his promoter was. All right, he was managed by Gary Gittleson, but that doesn't tell me who his promoter
We
was.
talk about Prince Charles Williams.
Yeah, at least during
He
that
got promoted,
time.
but he was with Cedric after. I don't know if he was with Cedric when he beat Ches, but he was with Cedric soon after that.
That would make sense because he immediately went to France for 3 fights in a
Yeah.
row and said did shit like that, like he'd
Hmm.
fucking shipped fighters off for, and then he also fought in Italy a handful of
Yeah.
times, Germany. So, and that also I think demonstrates though that I mean, look, dude, if you're a star, if you're able to entice people, if you're able to draw, you're not going to be fighting abroad unless you're going on some sort of world tour and you're like a Muhammad Ali and you're
Sure.
just fighting wherever the fuck because wherever the fuck you go, you're drawing. That's different, but that I don't think that was the case here. It was more that, kind of building a more a case of having to build your star overseas or having to go where the money is, having to go where maybe a promoter will or a venue would be willing to pay you a chunk of money to fight X amount of times over a, a certain period of time, which is what probably wound up happening. But again, demonstrating a overall lack of star power for Charles Williams, who had a good personality and gave a good interview. It's just that he wasn't a star.
And there wasn't a lot of guys that he can like, be a star against during that era too. Like I'm trying to think during that light heavyweight division. So let's see. He becomes champion around what was it, 80s? Like I just said, 87. And from there, who else were the champions around that time? Like Dennis Andres, JB Williamson, uh, pulling at straws here. I'm sure I'm forgetting somebody or another around that time, but like, WBO was just starting to come around. Like it wasn't like a really star-studded division by the late 80s, all right?
Wow, looks like
Oh,
Boxer
Virgil
changed.
Hill as well. Virgil Hill was around for a while.
Yeah, Boxer changed their ratings page. I like it. Um, No, they that was right around the time they had, I mean, at least in terms of the contenders and also fellow titleists in the division. Yeah, Virgil Hill, Ray Leonard, because he made that brief stop in
Nah,
the
that don't count.
that doesn't well, I mean, he had a belt technically. Dennis Andrews
Yeah,
though, yeah, Graciano Roscigiani was in the ratings. Frankie Swindell's in the ratings. Leslie Stewart, Uriah Grant. I mean, not to talk shit about any of those guys, but that's not a super deep division overall. There's a couple. It's kind of like a top heavy division.
sure. So he just became, like the thing about Prince Charles Williams though is that like a lot of Cedric's champions back in the 90s and the late 80s, early 90s, Cedric more or less stayed within the IBF. Like he was their top promoter for a number of years and he was always supplying champions from them, but like he was always promoting their champions, but like you said, a lot of those guys were fighting abroad, even if they were from America. Like Kennedy McKinney, he won his first title in Sardinia, I believe, when he beat Welcome Nita, and Leroy Murphy would travel abroad, all of them. But so Williams was like one of those guys, like the boxing writers and the magazines were all giving credit for being one of the top, if not the top light heavyweight, but just a guy that fell under the radar. And he never unified with Hill either, unfortunately. So like he just by the time he ended up losing his title to Henry Mask in like 19 in the early 90s, it almost seemed like he was just gonna go by the wayside. But then to his credit, he ends up going and fighting James Toney, and that's one of the more memorable like fights for me as a kid. All right, because like a little backstory, that was like when I was first getting into the sport of boxing. Again, like the early 90s, I'm starting to watch it with my dad and all that, and I knew who Oscar De La Hoya was. And De La Hoya that night fought Jorge Paez, and I knew who Paez was. Not so much that I followed his career. I already just saw him as the crazy dude with the funky hair, and I already seen a few of his fights. Like Paez was easily, identifiable for a kid or anybody for that matter, right? That you would remember him. And so I remember watching that, and I was like, oh, I didn't know who James Toney was, but I ended up watching that with my dad too. But the backstory to Toney against Prince Charles Williams and how that came to fruition was after Prince Charles lost the belt to Henry Mask. Even before that, he was like he called up Jackie Callan, I believe, one day on a cold call and was like, "Listen, this is Prince Charles Williams. I think me and James Toney would make for a great fight one day. Let me know what you think about it." And left a message. They ended up talking a little bit. And this was before he lost the belt to Mask. And I think Tony was even like super middleweight champion. But then it made even more sense. So they reached out to him again after he lost the belt and he was like, oh, we could still make this fight and yada, yada, yada. And so they made the deal where he was going to move down to super middleweight to challenge him. Now we've seen that happen before, Pat, right? Remember when Chad Dawson moved down to fight Andre Ward? You're shaking your head.
Yeah,
Go
or Chris Berg
ahead.
moved down to light
Go ahead.
heavyweight.
Sure, sure. But the funny thing about this one, and I'll just leave it at that and I'll let you take over, is that the reason why apparently Williams was able to shed the weight so easily to get down to 168 is because he had a soda addiction. And according to an article in Ring Magazine, they said that Prince Charles used to down about 15 to 20 cans of Coke or whatever type of soda it was a day. Like he always had one. And so when he cut that out, the weight came off easily.
Yikes, dude. They say women weaken legs, or well, Mick said that women weaken legs. But yeah, I don't know what the fuck soda will do to you, but I've seen videos of them cleaning toilets with Coca-Cola and shit. So I can definitely tell you it ain't doing anything fucking good. Now, yeah, I mean, this was obviously Also, apart from Charles Williams' backstory, which it's more interesting than a lot of people know, because like we said, he's kind of a guy that's fallen by the wayside and been forgotten by history a little bit. Also going into the fight was James Toney's backstory, and a lot of people already knew quite a bit about that because he had been around for a few years by this point. A lot of people remember too that they think of James Toney in the early 90s and they think of the loss to Roy Jones. I get it. Probably his biggest fight, and it was a bit of an embarrassment. But also by that time, though, he had already been around and like he had like I don't want to compare him to Johnny Tapia because that's too extreme, but more in the sense that he had like been given chances already. He'd already
Mhm.
gotten in trouble. He was already known as like a kind of a short fuse type of guy. He had already had trouble with managers and promoters that had been publicized and issues, etc. Issues training, issues making weight, that kind of stuff. And so for James Toney, it was like, the early 90s version of James Toney was a cantankerous kind of like grumpy dude, but then like he'd win a fight and he'd like go on a funny rant or something like that. That was kind of like the cycle. He'd be all pissy during the fucking training and then say something funny afterwards. But that was the question, was like, James Toney is the star going into this fight. And I mean, he also struggled quite a bit against Charles Williams, and Charles Williams also showed glimpses of why. I mean, he probably came into that fight with like three, four, five losses. Some of them happened earlier in his career, but he also showed glimpses of why he was popular and why also people believed in him.
I mean, he like it wasn't so much that he mauled Tony, but like he used his weight on him and like did it in like an intelligent manner where he smothered Tony's offense because Tony was ridiculously good on the inside, and eventually that did break through. But like he really had to work for it. It was a grueling fight where like it was hard to score and probably hard to like really watch too if like in certain angles because it was so much infighting. But like just a brutal, brutal fight. And Williams, to his credit, like we said, a lot of guys have moved down in weight and just like, completely lost it from, the weight loss and just being weakened and all that. If anything, he looked as strong as he ever did. But I mean, Tony, eventually showed his class and then scored one of the most picturesque knockouts of the 90s. Like, if it wasn't the knockout of the year, it probably should have been because, like, it was beautiful, man. The way, last round, round 12, he sets it up, he backs up a little bit. He's not on the ropes anymore. Jabs, jabs, kind of to get his guard down a little. And then he comes in, boom, with that right hand. And not only is it such a beautiful right hand, it's the way Williams falls, right? Like he has that sideways thing where his body bends to like a weird angle and he slowly and just crashes hard, and it's beautiful. Like it's a gorgeous knockout and it makes you realize why you love the sport of boxing because it's such a beautiful knockout. And afterwards too, like, Larry Merchant, who sometimes it was hard to get him really impressed because if you did, you get a reaction out of him. And Merchant kind of paused for a moment and he was like, guys, we're watching a great fighter here. And like he just broke it down basically how like Williams was like, giving him the shit and like he just broke him down and took him out. But that's I just wanted to bring him up because not only for that fight too, but like two fights that never get talked about today, and they're two of the like two of the most brutal fights of the entire decade of the 90s, whereas fights with Murky Sosa. The Murky Sosa fights were just, bro, that's some caveman shit that you're watching there. How many fights in history can you recall off the top of your head? Or like that we've watched or just in general, where the referee stops it because both guys took too much punishment. You know what I mean? It's not so much that they had to do it because of a technicality or like someone's eyes got swollen shut because of a headbutt or some dumb shit. Like, no, both of these guys, they had to stop the fight because both of them had just been like beaten to hell. That was their first fight.
Yeah, Sosa was an underrated puncher too.
Monster. Yeah.
Dude got well, and he got taken out in a couple of his bigger fights was the problem. So it was like, got pretty much forgotten about. But that the knockout of Charles Williams was one of the big reasons why he got that fight with Roy Jones, which obviously didn't go his way. But,
What's sad about Sosa too is that like there was I don't know if it was a Ring magazine. It was in one of the magazines back then. It wasn't KO. It might have been Ring or World Boxing or one of them. But before the Roy Jones fight, they did a list of like the best chins in boxing, and Sosa was ranked number one. saying that he had the best chin. And then so the very next fight, Jones drops him and just beats him around for 2 rounds. But like, um,
It's
I
what
love some
happens, dude. I mean, shit doesn't happen in a fucking in a vacuum. You know, like that shit, the damage is cumulative.
that's crazy. But I mean, like, if no one's ever seen like the Sosa Prince Charles fights, especially the first one, you got to seek it out.
Yeah, dude, for sure. Um, Funnily enough, too, just as a kind of like a postscript on the fucking James Toney Charles Williams fight, Tony got pissed off. He was pissed off fight week, and he was pissed off after the fight too. He was always
Of
pissed
course
off.
he was.
Yeah, but he was pissed because he said, "Oh, the MGM fucked me over. MGM was supposed to put us in a big suite, and they only put us in like a regular room." And like he didn't like the advertisements. He said that like they were like too many of the advertisements featured Oscar
Hmm.
and not enough
Which they
featured
did.
him. Well,
Which they
Oscar,
did. Yeah.
he was the fucking budding star. And so he was pissed off that he thought that he wasn't getting treated correctly and all sorts of shit. And like I said, you know, it was a fairly close fight. I thought that Tony was probably a little farther ahead on the cards, but even so, his eye was fucked up. His eye was not in good shape. It was basically closed, and that might have been stopped, you know, in some other era. But nonetheless, he was still wound up getting the stoppage, and that shit, like you said, was a classic fucking knockout. Dude almost did a cartwheel.
Sure. It was bad, man. But that was just one dude I wanted to bring up because we never bring him up. I don't think he ever really gets talked about today. If I ever saw him somewhere, I would love to talk to him because like it's I want to know, man, like what did Cedric compel you to go travel around the world to defend your belt for this X, Y, and Z, or you did this or you did that? Did you ever try to fight Virgil? Like, ever try to fight Michael Moore, which I'm sure he did. Like, it was.
Yeah, dude, no question. And it would, well, it's too bad Ced's not around because we could get more answers about that too. But
I would ask Seth about that too, and I wish I did ask more when he and I just had one-on-one because we were around each other, just he and I, hours and hours at a time. But he would always be on the phone trying to negotiate or trying to find a new deal, so it was like hard to track him down to like, concentrate on something because his mind was always somewhere else. But like once in a while, when it'd be like some downtime, we would talk, and then he would give me like funny stories about how certain fights were made or whatever happened. And he was just such a character, man. I miss that dude.
tons of stories, that's for sure. Tons of experience in the game, no question. Um, all right, so I wanted to bring up somebody from way back. So you already kind of set us up earlier. The light heavyweight division goes back 120 years, dude. It's old storied division. We've talked about it before, and I've kind of made slight fun of people who insist on saying things like the original eight divisions because there wasn't a real, you know, whole long period of time where there truly were eight divisions, and there were junior divisions going back a lot longer than people believe. But nonetheless, even so, the light heavyweight division, dude, it's 120 years old, and it's is one of the, you know, back in the day they had just an open division, and that was
Mhm.
boxing. You know, whoever was the champion overall was the champion overall. But at some point, they recognized that, like, I think one of the main times where it really started to come into the mainstream, just to kind of branch off for a moment, was when Nonpareil Jack Dempsey, many people, sports writers and pundits and stuff like that, started believing, like, damn, he's fucking good. He's really skilled. Now we know John L. Sullivan's bigger than him, and we know John L. Sullivan's really strong and a bigger puncher. But we feel like, in terms of skill, if you put Dempsey in there, he could probably beat Sullivan. And that's when they started thinking, like, that's not when the middleweight division was invented or anything. But nonetheless, I think that that's where it really started kind of popping up in people's heads, like, all right, we need these other divisions. Like, the divisions are necessary because, like, it doesn't make sense. How could we believe that this guy's the best, but this guy might beat him, though he's smaller? Point is, you know, light heavyweight for that reason. Going back, they had to separate out. They obviously recognized pretty early on that divisions were necessary. Size discrepancies could make the difference in a fight. And so they needed to figure out, okay, these are the big guys who are whooping each other's asses. We need to step down a little bit. And that's pretty much what light heavyweight was. And so, anyway, long story short, going back, to when the light heavyweight division would have been still somewhat young, only about 20, 25 years old. A dude named Leo Lomsky is a guy who, I mean, I know I'm kind of digging slightly deep here, but if you go on to his box rec, it's really not that deep, dude. He's somebody who probably should be talked about a whole lot more. And if you look at some of the fighters that he defeated in the 1920s, it's impressive stuff.
Well, I haven't looked at his record in a while, even thought about this guy for a minute, so I'll give you that one there.
Like I
But
said, I'm digging a little bit.
yeah, that's pretty awesome. But I know he was such a monster puncher, and then he fought Loughran for the belt, didn't he?
Yeah.
And he almost knocked Loughran out. Like he dropped him early on and like knocked him silly, and Loughran had to get up and skedaddle and make sure, he won a decision over him. As I'm bringing up his record right now.
He had a pretty condensed career. Like the last few years of his career were less active. And so he still was technically an active fighter, but most of his work was done in the 1920s. And the light heavyweight division in the 1920s was a pretty fucking serious division. You had some really truly good light heavyweights and guys who were middleweights and kind of struggling to make the weight who went up and fought at light heavyweight and otherwise did pretty well. But Leo Lumsky was a guy who was, generally not letting that happen.
I mean, when you have to fight guys like Jimmy Braddock and Maxie Rosenblum over and over, and also, even though Slapsy Maxie, he was one of the most fucking awkward fighters and awful fighters to fight in history, where you're never going to have an easy time with him. Mickey Walker, and, the list goes on and on, like Tuffy Griffiths and Jimmy Braddock, who I think I just mentioned, Pete Latzo, Mike Mateague, again, Tommy Loughran, I just mentioned, like, it's.
Some and a handful of heavyweights too, and some of the best ones
Yeah.
of that time.
Absolutely. Like, if you have Kingfish Levinsky, who is most notably known first off for his name, but then second for being the guy that was so terrified of Joe Louis that he crouched in his corner and kind of just waved it off during the first round because I don't know what the fuck happened, but he had like a panic attack or something. But when that didn't happen, he was one an absolute terror at both heavyweight and light heavyweight, like a top contender, who fought them all. And like you said, that was like basically as deep of a division as you can find back then. And Lomsky was a dude who was a massive puncher himself. He was a dude that like could carry a wallop punch, and in the era of no decisions or just like, winning points and stuff like that, he has a number of knockouts where it didn't need to go for that route. And Tommy Loughran, excuse me, I'm over here losing my voice and shit. Tommy Loughran is recognized as one of the greatest as one of the greatest light heavyweights in history, even though his prime was what, over 100 years ago now, I would say, huh? Or close
Yeah,
to
and
it.
he didn't even hold the championship all that long, but I mean, look at his record.
Yeah, Loughran is an incredible fighter. And most historians, at least the older ones, still consider him probably the best fighter to ever come out of Philadelphia. And when you think more about Loughran as well, and you consider when you read like books about him and interviews with him, and you find out that he was handicapped more or less throughout his career because like he had one of the best left hands in history, one of the best jabs, one of the best everything, just the best left hands in history. And the reason why that was is because like his right hand was useless. It was broken like all the time. And to his own admission, anytime he used it in a fight, it was only good for like one or two hits. He would hit you once with it, hit you twice with it. And usually that would be enough to like really stun you because I guess he said he could hit with it if he really wanted to, but it was so damaged all he can do. And then he just had to box you with his left hand. When he fought Leo Lomsky, there's a photo of it too. And I remember in a book, the Nat Fleischer book, the Pictorial History of Boxing, there's a photo of Lomsky running across the ring, and you see Loughran on his ass with his feet up in the air, like skidding across the ring. And it looks like, I've never seen video of the fight, but for all accounts, it looks like, Lomsky just knocked the shit out of him right there. And it says that he's, had 2 9 counts on him in the first round. So put that in perspective today, and you think about like the light heavyweight champion, like a guy like Bivol, right? Getting hit by somebody, I guess, Joe Smith. All right. Lomsky's better than Joe Smith, but just use that as an example. And knocking him down twice in the first round for 9 counts of each time. People would be going fucking nuts.
Absolutely, dude. And like you said, Loughran was a fighter who was definitely considered on the upper echelon for like a while, even
Mm-hmm.
before he won the title. But like I've said on numerous shows before, I tend to give extra credit to fighters who are able to accomplish things, especially a lot of things, without much punching power. And that
Sure.
definitely fits Tommy Loughran to a T because he was like never knocking anybody out. And on top of that, he basically fled the light heavyweight division because he got sick of trying to make the light heavyweight limit and took on heavyweights with no power. Even, even less power at heavyweight than he had at light heavyweight, and still wound up coming pretty close against a number of them and a number of monsters too. Like he was not a
Sure.
big dude.
But, going through Lomsky's record also too, like, he beats Tiger Flowers. Tiger Flowers is the guy that beat, arguably, I guess, Harry Greb for the middleweight belt, depending on what historians have said in the past of who deserved that decision. But regardless, Flowers was a great fighter, an absolute great fighter who suffered an untimely death, and being able to beat him, I guess you have to look at the whoever was writing on it, if it was on the up and up or whatever, but like still being able to beat him was like a big accomplishment. Beating Maxi Rosenblum, even though you fight him a bunch of times, he trades wins and losses, still getting a win over a guy of that pedigree is huge. The fact that he beat the absolute daylights apparently out of Mike McTeague after losing to Loughran proves a lot right there too. McTeague was a long-standing former light heavyweight champion who had just been around the block for a long time, both at middleweight, light heavyweight, and a few excursions at heavyweight. So, like, you know, this is a good guy to bring up, absolutely, and a person that probably has now have not been brought up in years.
Well, yeah, nobody else is going to be talking about Leo Lumsky on a show. I can
Yeah.
guarantee you that. And I'm not going to lie and say I'm the Leo Lumsky fucking expert or anything like that. But nonetheless, he was definitely a fighter from an interesting time and somebody who probably deserves a little bit more play and isn't going to get it because he wasn't a big champion or anything like that. But yeah, dude, I think that there are a lot of these fighters during these eras that were deep, tough, and during a time when boxing was really starting to blow up, and they really get lost in the shuffle because maybe they didn't win a title or they didn't hold the title very long or whatever the case may be. Leo Lomsky is one of those guys for sure.
Yeah, good call. Good call. Um, hmm. So what I want to talk about after this one. So we went back there. Actually enough, I just want to get your opinion. We don't have to stay too much on it, but we've talked about it because he's a former heavyweight champion and obviously made his name at heavyweight and stuff. But like, what did you ever think of Michael Moore's light heavyweight reign?
Um, Kind of overrated. I mean, like
I agree with you on that, but like the potential of the fights that could have been there still are salivating when you think back on it because he was an absolute terror. Like he was an unfinished product, clearly in the way he would
yeah.
fight and stuff, but like the viciousness that he had at light heavyweight was clearly lacking at heavyweight. I mean, initially there was still there until he had a couple of rough patches where he was just kind of like, oh shit. And then, he became more cautious, but light heavyweight more was, something to reckon with.
Yeah, dude, it's definitely like I've never met him, so I don't know him, but
Mhm.
it sounds like he's kind of suffered from like his even early on in his career. He's another guy who they did a lot of focus on in the boxing magazines in the late 80s and early 90s.
Yeah,
Um he's had issues with trainers, managers, promoters. He just seems like he's a guy who like wherever the fuck it is he is, he doesn't want to be there. Like
sure.
if he's in the gym, he doesn't want to fucking be there. If he's out doing some publicity thing, he doesn't want to fucking be there. If he's
Hmm.
at home, he doesn't want to fucking be there. I don't know. Like I don't know him, but that's always the impression that I've gotten. And so it seems like, from very early on in his career, he was having issues with Emmanuel Stewart at Kronk. He was having
Hmm.
issues as soon as he left Kronk. So I mean, like, I don't know how he was managed or steered in the early days or whatever, but there were a number of fights like we were just talking about when like in the mid and late 80s of the light heavyweight division. That was when he was starting to when he was starting to emerge and he entered the rankings and I want to say like 1989 or 88 or 89 or something like that. So he was around for a minute. It's not like, it's not like he just kind of came out of nowhere. But then on top of that, the issue with the WBO belt and stuff like that, there's no issue with me, but as we've talked about numerous times, it was kind of lightly regarded up into a certain point, and then
Mhm.
it was also like nobody was in a big hurry. You know what I mean? Like you weren't really, you were like disregarding their rankings. You weren't really worried about the champions in the WBO until like the mid 90s, really. And even then it still took a few years. So anyway, there were some stones left unturned for his light heavyweight reign is the big problem. And while he looked like a monster, the opposition is kind of lacking.
1,000%. I totally agree with you on that percentage. It was just the fact that, like, people sometimes still, well, not so much today, but like back in the day, they'll bring up, yo, what do you think about light heavyweight more against this one or that one? And it would make for very exciting fights. Like him fighting Virgil Hill would be a very interesting fight because Hill had a totally different style of, he wasn't a runner, but, a jabber and a boxer as opposed to more was like a power puncher. And
Mhm.
the clash of those styles would have been very interesting. But, the couple
I
of
probably
times
would
when
have favored Hill.
agreed. And what I was about to say was that like as dominant as Mora looked at light heavyweight, there were a couple of instances where he was dragged into the later rounds of fights. And like one of the did he
Yeah,
fight Leslie
that's
Stewart
the
twice or once? I don't remember. But when he fought Leslie Stewart, Stewart was like giving him a lot of problems. Like Stewart's an underrated champion, a guy that, was a champion during the mid 80s and all that, but like a good fighter and not one of them that was going to get bowled over immediately by just the pure power of Moore. So like Moore had to struggle a little bit in that one. And there were other fights too where Moore was in complete control of the fight, but it extended into the late rounds because those guys just knew how to survive. There was one of them, it was Allen. Marcellus Allen was the guy's name. Marcellus Allen. He the only reason why I know that name like that too is that like I think a year later his ex-girlfriend murdered him, like, stabbed him to death or shot him or something like that. Yeah.
yeah, of course that's the detail you'd remember.
What can I say, right? My morbid ass, but like that's he was a guy that extended more to like 9 rounds. He didn't really do much, but he just knew how to survive and Mora subsequently didn't look that impressive trying to chase him down, you know what I mean? So that's I was just trying to get your perspective on like that type of idea, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that also there's a tendency, we've been talking about this too, because the International Boxing Hall of Fame, we just did the show and the
Mhm.
ballots are out right now. So we've been discussing this, but there was also a very public conversation on Twitter, X, whatever the fuck you want to call that stupid ass platform now. Is they were talking about, like, for instance, fuck, who the fuck were they talking about? Shane Mosley. Sorry. They're talking about Shane Mosley and his lightweight run. And that was kind of the
Oh
topic of
boy.
discussion for like 2 or 3 days. And similarly, I think that I bring that up because we're talking about Michael Moore. And I think that people have the tendency to look at what he did at heavyweight and then almost like apply that because he won the heavyweight title. They're like, oh, see, he was a great light heavyweight. That has nothing to do with light heavyweight anything. Just like Shane Mosley skipping the 140-pound division and going to 147, which was indeed extremely impressive, especially for Oscar De La Hoya, and winning that fight and doing it in the fashion that he won it. That's impressive as is. You don't
Mhm.
have to then turn around and say, see, that makes him a great lightweight. No, it doesn't. That doesn't have anything to do with lightweight. He wasn't lightweight when it happened. Similarly, and just my last point on this, people say, oh, Roy Jones was such a great light heavyweight. He went up to heavyweight and won a title. What that doesn't have anything to do with light heavyweight at all. It's a totally different division. So you have to assess, what we're talking about here. And I bring up the Shane Mosley shit because his lightweight reign was not, it wasn't bad. It just wasn't that good. Like the opposition's not super great, dude. He looked fantastic, just like Michael Moore looked fantastic against not super great opposition. Conversely, you have other fighters who are dominating these divisions for years at a time and doing it against a tough division. Like when I brought up fucking Joe Old Bones Brown the other day, when I'm like, bro, he fucking dominated for like 6 years. And that shit was a tough fucking division. And he went to war with a bunch of fucking fighters. And it was, anyway. So similarly, bringing it back to Michael Moore, that's kind of how I see it. A lot of potential, passes the eye test, no question. But in terms of like, marking him a fucking all-time great, no, not in my opinion.
Totally. I agree with that.
Yeah, so for people to say things like, "Oh, the only lightweights that are better than Shane Mosley are maybe Roberto Duran," and I'm like, what?
No one even brought up Benny Leonard either. Like other guys who have been considered like the top 3 or 5 all-time greats. You know what I mean? Like, well, that not regardless of Joe Brown, because like he is in the top 10, right? And just like if you know your business and you know him and like his record, you know his credentials. But I'm talking like no one even brought up like Benny Leonard. Like no one brought up like, Joe Gans,
Yeah,
even though
Joe
that's way over 100
Gans,
years ago, but just
Ad
guys that have always been,
Volgast.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
guys that have always been like considered the top of echelon of the light heavyweight, the lightweight division in history. No one mentioned Carlos Ortiz. No one mentioned Ike Williams, Tony Canzoneri, Barney Ross, like nothing like that. It's just absolute chirps.
yeah. I'm not. Yeah. Well, and that's not even to say that we have the answers. We're not saying that. We're saying we don't have the answers is the point. So other people saying, "No, I got the answer," is like, "Do you? Do you really have
Yeah.
the answer?" No, you don't. That's okay. And it's okay to not have the answer. That's the whole point. Have a discussion, learn more, read more. It's all good. Read a book. Anyway, back to the light heavyweight division. No, that's a good point about Michael Moore, dude. As like in a lot of people, I think you're gonna find hearing them say, "Oh, he has such an underrated light heavyweight reign," and I think it's the opposite. I think it's a little overrated. Um, but I sounded like you were gonna bring somebody else up too, though.
Oh, well, I was just thinking too, because like, when we're talking about like when you talk about the light heavyweight division, I remember back in the day before Glenn Johnson became champion. I was always comparing them to like a 70s contender because they both had kind of similar records in terms of like wins and losses and stuff like that. But they both just gave everybody absolute hell. And not only that, they were coming on, when they would lose, chances are they probably should have got the decision. So like, another forgotten light heavyweight, he never became champion, but he was always just kind of a perennial contender and a pain in the ass was Jesse Burnett.
That's a good one. That's a good one, and he had a couple of pretty memorable fights too.
Sure. Yeah, Burnett was just one of those dudes that like he's never remembered today. Unless, I mean, if you're from like the Southern California area and you're from that time period, or if you're like a historian or something, you do know that name and you've probably met him. And I've never had a chance to meet him, but like, I know he was like active at one time around the gyms and stuff. I don't know if how he is today, but like, although a lot of old timers will talk about him and just say how, he was just a consummate professional. All you gotta do is watch him fight. You know what I mean? Like even though he didn't have the best record, sometimes he didn't put on, depending on what kind of effort he put on here and there in a fight and stuff like that. But like you just knew he was one of those guys who just knew how to fight. Like everything you watched about him, he did well. You know what I mean?
Yeah, dude, absolutely. And one of the guys that, well, we brought him up actually on a different show because we were talking about James Scott when we were
That's
talking
right.
about,
Yeah.
yeah, when
Yeah.
we were talking about James Scott, we brought up Jesse Burnett, and that was when they were both undefeated too. They fought in Miami and they fought undefeated. And in any case, um, the light heavyweight division during that time, the 1970s and early 80s, more so, I think, like the kind of like late 70s. Fucking chef's kiss. Light heavyweight division at that time. Thank goodness we have a lot of video of, a lot of those fights at the time because there was a pretty good investment into the light heavyweight division and a number of the fighters there. And also, luckily, a handful of middleweights also moved up to help make it more exciting too. But Yaki Lopez, another one of those fighters from that same era, who Jesse Burnett fought twice, three times maybe. And in any case, yeah, dude, right in that little kind of chunk of time in the mid to late 70s, fit right in.
Sure. And Burnett, being from Southern California, there was always going to be just tons of different pros to work with, to spar with, in the same gyms, training and all that. Like, even if you're not going to be a top level guy, like in terms of being a contender, you just know how to fight in general. And if you get called upon at some point or another time, you're gonna spring an upset, or an upset's gonna happen to you. And Burnett was one of those guys that's like he didn't have amazing power. He wasn't like overly fast or did everything overly great. He just knew how to do everything well. So that made him a good pro, but it didn't really give him over the hump when it came to such a deep era, Because the thing with Burnett was not only that, when he really stepped up, he had a couple of title shots. Like one came early on against the vacant title when John Conte gave up the belt, he fought Miguel Angel Coelho, who is a totally forgotten name today because really he's just kind of like a footnote in history. But like he ended up getting stopped in that fight. Coelho was a pretty good fighter, but like you didn't really hear much about him after that. And other times too, like he would, he was kind of stuck. Burnett was the type of guy that was kind of stuck with a bunch of contenders. You know what I mean? Like the guys in the middling of it. But he would trade wins and losses with them, but he would usually end up on the losing end of a lot of those fights. Like you said, he fought Yaki Lopez 3 times and lost two of them. He lost to Jerry the Bull Martin, who was another guy that had just been around the way, for, another contender from that era. He lost to Ladi Mawali, who we've talked about before on the show, and James Scott,
Yeah,
if you
Burnett went through the
understand.
grinder, dude.
Really did. He fought them all, man. Like, there wasn't a guy, Mustafa Wazaja, Eddie Mustafa Muhammad, and even let me see it over here. There was another guy I was just looking at, Pete McIntyre. So Pete McIntyre is like another guy. I'll just go off the beaten path really quick. Who horrible record if you looked at it and you'd be like, who was that guy? And if you ever heard of him, chances are is that you watched that highlight video of Matthew San Muhammad almost knocking him senseless and then raising his hands up like that while the punch where like
Yeah.
McIntyre's throwing the punch, Muhammad hits him, and then he
And like
just
as
goes
he's
off.
falling, he does a fucking yeah.
Yeah. But even though he had a bad record, McIntyre was a monster puncher who apparently I don't know, think there's any video of the fight, but they said he put such a beating on Mike Corey that it like altered his career for good. And he also it was like a nasty one. And he beat Willie Edwards and a few other guys. Like he was a good fighter. You know what I mean? Just a really tough guy, also from the California circuit. So all those guys were tough. Like you said, Burnett went through the grinder. But he always plugged along, man. He was just one of those competent pros like Glenn Johnson, who just, if you needed him, he was going to fight. He didn't really care if it was going to be, short notice, this or that. Most of the time it would be short notice. Fuck it. But he was going to be ready to go. And promoters knew that they were going to get a fight with Burnett. He wasn't going to lay down. He was going to give you rounds, and chances are he'd make a fight close. So he'd be popular.
And he actually ended the career of Victor Galindez.
Right.
Bill Kaplan promoted that fucking fight at the Disneyland Hotel that I've stayed at in fucking Anaheim, which is like, just across the way from Disneyland.
Mhm.
And they fought Victor Galindez was supposed to fight Marvin Kamel, and Marvin Kamel wound up having to pull out over an injury or some shit. And then so Jesse Barnett issued his ass a fucking beat down in the Disneyland Hotel and ended his career. And then on top of that, Galindez, I don't think it was related, but Galindez died. Well, no, it wasn't related because he died in a fucking car accident. But I mean, I guess the idea that he was doing race car shit and acting crazily, but point is, he died a few months later on a race car track, and that was his last fight, and that was, I think, what convinced him to, nope, that's it, bro.
Well, so what happened was is that, that was the newly formed cruiserweight division. So by 1980, Burnett, again, he'd been through the light heavyweight meat grinder as well as you could be. And when the cruiserweight division opened, that gave him and other longtime contenders who had been slogged in that fucking light heavyweight division for
And
so
we're
long.
just
Oh,
sick of making 175, dude. They were like,
yeah,
oh
and just
fuck,
fight. And when
thankfully.
you look at the champions at that point too, you had Saad Muhammad, you had Michael Spinks on the rise, Eddie Mustafa Muhammad, Marvin Johnson. Like it was really tough to break through that type of
Yeah,
crowd. You know what I mean? So
perfect
these
time to
guys
get
were
the
like,
fuck out of there.
yeah, oh, this is a new division. What, a bunch of unknown names. I'm gonna clean the fuck up over here. So a lot of them moved to 190, but they were already kind of past it at that point too. Galindez was the biggest name at that point to move up because he had just lost his belt again for the second time to Marvin Johnson, and he felt this was going to be an easy route to go up there. So, like you said, he was going to fight Marvin Camel. I guess was it going to be for the title? Probably, right? Or
I would imagine, yeah, but I'm not gonna lie, I don't know.
so, anyways, he fights Jesse Burnett, and it's a rematch because Galindez initially beat him in their first fight, which was a close fight. And this fight's on YouTube. And the most interesting thing about it is that like Galindez is going through the motions. He's completely washed and he gets outboxed, he gets dropped. And it's like either round 8 or round 9. There's like kind of a weird scene where after the round ends, Galindez initially thinks the fight is over and he tries to go and greet Burnett and like smiles at him. And Burnett just kind of looks at him and walks away. And then Galindez realizes that the fight's still going and just kind of trudges back to his corner. But um Anyways, long story short, they said that Galindez suffered detached retinas in both of his eyes, and that was what like set him off for retirement. So of course he wanted to go into race car driving after that for whatever reason.
Yeah, where
Yeah,
you require good vision.
yeah. And like his wife was like trepidatious and everyone else, like she was saying, I don't understand why he wants to keep on doing things like this. Like I just want him to be home and relax with my family. And it was sad. But anyways, Burnett renewed, got new life in his career from that fight, right? And after that, same thing though. Like, he loses to Bash Ali, who was another like contender from the early 80s, especially in the cruiserweight division. But he's like losing more than he's winning, right? In some of these fights, again, he should have won. For instance, when he fought Leon Spinks in 1982, Leon Spinks at this point now, instead of like being a light heavyweight that moved up to cruiserweight, he was the heavyweight that was like, fuck this, I'm gonna go down to cruiserweight and try to make my name over there. And when he fought Burnett for the NABF title, Burnett probably should have won that fight too. It was a close fight, but Burnett, did what he needed to, and Spinks was just kind of blah blah. And that was it. That was just another hard line for a guy like him. He retired with a record of 25 and 17, but just look at the names on his record, man. That resume is like you said, bro, like it's untouched. He fought them all. He didn't give a fuck who he had to fight, and I give him all the respect.
And he fought in one of his last fights, one of the most forgettable champions on the face of the planet, with all due
ST Gordon.
respect, because there's like no photos of the guy on the planet, dude. There's
And he was a bodybuilder, ST Gordon. He was a
nobody knows what he looks like. Nobody can describe him. We need a fucking composite sketch artist. I mean, again, respectfully, but yeah, dude, he was a cruiserweight champion for a cup of coffee, and like,
And it's kind of
that's
stinks too because that's what happened with those light heavyweights. You had Jesse Burnett, he gets beat up by ST Gordon and stopped, right? Yaki Lopez moved up to cruiserweight and fought Carlos De Leon and got beat up and stopped. And it's like it's too bad because no disrespect to De Leon, no disrespect to Burnett, not Burnett, ST Gordon, especially De Leon, because De Leon was a talented fighter. ST Gordon was just more of a brute, but you feel for these guys because like you think if they were just, more in their prime and in their natural division, they probably would have cleaned house on either one of them. But circumstances of it being they couldn't.
I mean, the dude. Again, I'm not arguing for him, but the dude's got wins over one of the most random names on his resume, Fred Haupt. I'm like, what is Fred
Oh,
Haupt
yeah,
doing?
yeah. Young Sanford?
Yeah, and Fred Haupt doing on his resume. But then he defeated Yaki Lopez, Carlos De Leon, Jesse Burnett, Trevor Berbick, like total random. And I mean,
It was a weird win too
for
for
a
Trevor.
condensed career, it's not bad whatsoever. It's just that, you say the name ST Gordon and people are like, "Who? What? What is that?"
And the Jimmy Cooney fight is like kind of funny in the sense because Gordon was a big dude who was pretty jacked, but Cooney was a monster, and ST Gordon was not a big guy in the sense of being tall. And it makes for such a weird dynamic. And like, yeah, he had to get DQ'd. It was awful. It was an awful, awful fight to watch. It is a weird career when you think about it.
Yeah, dude. Yeah, I don't know. That just stood out to me for a second, and I was like, wait, I got to bring him up because that's just such a strange. We're never going to talk about ST Gordon ever
And
again.
I don't even know what his real name is. I don't think
Yeah,
it's
what does
ST.
ST even stand for? I don't know. I really don't. No, that's a good one, dude. That is a good one. But that's also one of the reasons why we're doing this show in particular. Because, like I said at the beginning, we've already talked about the Bernard Hopkinses and the Bob Fosters and the Archie Moores and stuff like that. We've already talked about those guys probably on multiple shows at this point. But so let's see, what are we about to talk about? Not going to bring up battling Siki, but I am going to bring him up in the sense that, so going back again to the kind of early beginnings of a lot of these divisions, it is important to remember who some of the first black champions were because in some of these divisions it took a while. Obviously, the history of heavyweight is very well known, but a statistic that a lot of people kind of forget about is how long it took number one for Jack Johnson to become the first black heavyweight champion. But then after that, how long it fucking took for another black heavyweight champion to come around? Just a string of mediocre white idiots between Jack Johnson and Joe Louis. Not totally true. There's some very good ones between there, but you know what I'm saying. But
And
a lot of them were mediocre. Not all of them, but a lot of them. Um, but similarly, you have Tiger Flowers as the very first black middleweight champion. Battling Siki was the first black light heavyweight champion and also the first African born world champion. I know that's kind of dodgy, and I've had people in the replies saying, like, don't bring that shit up, just bring up individual African countries. My bad. Simply noting that that's how it's history often remembers it. But then again, it takes another almost 15 years for John Henry Lewis. John Henry Lewis had a really, really interesting, not only career, but, he's a pretty interesting dude. But he also is, I think, to a lot of even historians, kind of mysterious.
well, there's not a lot on him besides if you really go
Yeah,
back and
that's what I mean.
really isn't. The first time I ever heard about him as a kid was I I wish I could find this fucking book because I have no idea what I did with it, Pat. And it was a cartoonist. All right, I don't remember the cartoonist name, but he was a black cartoonist that was famous, I think around like Chicago or so. And I bought his book when I was a kid because
Not
like
Ted Carroll.
I don't think his name was Ted Carroll. I don't know. I can't. I'd have to look at the book. I don't remember his name, but like he did cartoons of because the first chapter was boxing. That's what made the book interesting to me, right? And it was like that was the most cartoons, but it was like the same style, like the kind of like the big head, the little bodies, the whole thing, and then like the captions on the side, how they would write. But like he did cartoons on a lot of like, forgotten way before Jack Johnson, former black champions or black fighters like Bill Richmond, he did a cartoon on. He did a cartoon on Bobby Dobbs. Um he even did a cartoon on the dude who beat Joe Louis in the amateurs, Clinton Bridges, I believe his name was. Like stuff like that, you know what I mean? So, anyways, what I'm getting at is that he did a cartoon on John Henry Lewis, who was the light heavyweight champion, and he was talking about like just how he beat Maxie Rosenblum and how he beat Bob Olin, and he shows him wearing his little crown, like they would do you remember the big head, and he had the little crown on the side and the
Yeah.
whole thing like that. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, well, it's a memorable name, and I remember hearing it when I was younger too. And I'm not gonna lie and be like, I'm not a John Henry Lewis expert by any means or anything like that, but also I think I remembered it just in the context of like, Joe Louis. The Lewis
Mhm.
name was just memorable to me. So you hear John Henry Lewis, and especially because he fought Joe Louis, I don't know why it just kind of stuck in my brain. But also it stuck in my brain, I think, because he was often named among the greatest light heavyweight champions of all time. Usually not very high on lists, but like, he would be mentioned alongside or just below some of the greatest and stuff like that on some of the light heavyweight rankings and lists and stuff like that. So I do remember hearing about him. But in any case, I know that he came from a boxing family. He had siblings who were also fighters and stuff like that. And so it wasn't like he was one of those guys who just kind of came out of nowhere. He actually had a pedigree, as it were, when it comes to boxing. And, he was a highly skilled guy.
I mean, and he also fought in a really tough era of the light heavyweights as well. Like you kind of like you mentioned earlier, during that time, like the 20s and into the 1930s, the middleweight and light heavyweight division kind of intermixed a lot with each other in terms of like fighting each other and sometimes guys moving up to challenge for the title and here and there out. And looking at John Henry Lewis's record, he was doing that same thing back then, kind of fighting a who's who of whoever it may be. And back then, it wasn't that big of a deal if you lost a few fights. Like if you lost a fight here and there, it wasn't like the end of your career. So like him losing to Maxie Rosenblum early on, like back to back almost, and another fight after that wasn't that big of a deal. still at that point, he's like beating everyone else up around him and like winning significantly more than he's ever losing. And he's like beating really good guys out there until, 1935 when he finally challenges Bob Olin for the championship. And Bob Olin is one of those guys who completely forgotten about in today's history books and anything like that because he was just kind of like a placement champion for, if you will, right? He beat Raxi Rosenblum for the title in a fight that no one expected him to win. And after he beat him, he was just kind of like a placement holder. And like no one knew what he was going to do. No one expected him to be champion for that long, and he wasn't. Because by the time John Henry Lewis ended up fighting him in 35, he wins the belt. But an interesting story that I'll give you really quickly about Olin before that fight is that he was trained by Ray Arcel. And Ray Arcel was saying before the fight that Olin was petrified, like absolutely petrified of John Henry Lewis and all this other stuff. And so like Arcel decided to take him to the doctor, and I forgot how they did it, but like Arcel either pretended he was going to be the fight. He switched something up that made it seem like Olin wasn't going to be the fighter. You know what I mean? He was like, "Here, my friend needs to get checked out," and blah 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 blah. Right? And so the doctor talked to him afterwards. The doctor was like, "Mr. Arcel," he was like, "There's absolutely nothing wrong with your friend over here. He is in perfect shape. It just seems like something is like really scaring him. Like he's having anxiety attacks." And Arcel ended up convincing Olin just to like he did some kind of brain like reverse psychology shit on him and like with the doctor and all that and made Olin convinced that he was like actually better than what he was. And then he said Olin went out there and fought the fight of his life instead of just being freaked out and like dying in the ring.
Jeez, dude. I
Yeah,
mean, I guess I get it. And especially because Arcel, he was often having to play psychologist and psychiatrist and shit
yeah.
like that with his fighters at the time, especially Lou Nova. That's for sure. Yeah, he's mixed up in some crazy shit. That's funny though. And yeah, you're right. I think Bob Olin is one of those guys who kind of gets lost to history. And it's like is on the cover of magazines and stuff like that. And then he loses the title and they're like, who was that? We don't remember who was that
A
guy?
lot of those
We
guys
don't
back then.
remember.
If you go back to like the 20s and 30s ring magazines, even the 40s, sometimes 50s,
There were some
whatever.
randos on the covers.
A lot of random guys that got to look back today and they'd be like future champion or top contender, this one, that one. You're like, huh?
Yeah, there's a couple of them that are like, oh, that guy sucked. Like looking, you're
I
like,
mean,
oh,
you
his
can go
record's
all we
bad.
can go all the way into the 70s and I'll name drop them here. Kathy Cat Davis. Hey yo.
Oh
But
no.
that's a whole other discussion. But I mean, the thing about John Henry Lewis though is that he wasn't during the 30s when he was champion. Joe Lewis was the one that got all the attention. You know what I mean? Joe Lewis was the black heavyweight champion, and being heavyweight champion is going to take like more attention, especially back then than anything, because you were the man of the world. It wasn't just in boxing. Like you were looked upon as that dude. There was no MMA back then. There was no UFC, like any of that type of shit. Wrestling was still like gaining its um popularity, I guess, in terms of the US and stuff like that. So like boxing was that main thing, you know what I mean? If you were the boxing heavyweight champion of the world, you were the baddest man on the planet. And so I guess correct no, you can tell me if you agree or not. I guess John Henry Lewis might have been in the shadow a little bit.
Oh, no question. Absolutely no question. And I mean, the lower weight fighters are anyway, just kind of by default. But also Joe Lewis was a star. He was a bigger puncher. There were criticisms, obviously the bum of the month club type of thing. Um, that was out in the open. It's not like that was like a hush hush thing or anything like that. But also, you just kind of have to take into account, like, yeah, fine. I guess he was fighting bum of the month, but he was also knocking the fucking shit out of him. Like, and that makes a difference. It makes a difference when you're doing what you're supposed to be. You're disposing of the trash. And so, but John Henry Lewis was a good puncher, but not a great puncher. He was more of a hard worker in the ring. But one of the things that did kind of present him as a bit of a throwback was that, according to him, and also according to some reports, he actually won the light heavyweight title while with a fucked up eye. and that he had already injured his eye and had already lost like significant portions of his vision in one of his eyes in like 1934, like several years or a year or so before he won the title, but several years before he had fought Joe Louis, because that's the story that everybody remembers pretty much about John Henry Lewis. They forget about the fucking 120 fights he had before that, understandably, because he took a licking, but he was also, Joe Louis was like 6'2", 6'3", 210, 220-ish, depending. And so not a massive heavyweight, but a heavyweight and a firm
Mm.
heavyweight. And in terms of punching power, and 100% absolute heavyweight. And then John Henry Lewis was like 5'10", 5'11", so not a big light heavyweight even, much less for heavyweight. But John Henry Lewis, because of um, I mean, I don't know. I couldn't say why they were friends or why there was camaraderie. I don't know. Perhaps it was because they were two of the black champions at the time when that would have stood out, no question. Because Joe Louis was also friends with Ray Robinson, although they came out of the same Detroit gym at some point. Nonetheless, point is they were friends, Lewis and Lewis, that is. And so the story everybody remembers was that John Henry Lewis moved up, as was often the case for a light heavyweight champion, to challenge the heavyweight champion at some point. But that the story behind it was that Lewis knew that John Henry Lewis had a fucked up eye, and that he had developed a cataract in one eye, and that I think that, the story was that it was getting more and more difficult for John Henry Lewis to slip past the physicals and, be
Yeah.
allowed to fight and licensed to fight. And so he knew he was going to be coming in on retirement pretty soon. Joe Louis gave him the opportunity and a big payday to challenge for the heavyweight championship, but took absolutely no mercy, or perhaps was extremely merciful in dispatching him in one round rather than punishing him for several. Depends on how you look at it, but beat the ever loving shit out of him, knocked him through the ropes. And on top of that, did it in front of his dad. John Henry Lewis's dad had traveled from like some faraway place to see his son, barely got a seat. And then just as he was getting seated, his son got the shit kicked out of him. And so it was like, what? That's it? And that was it. And again, the story was that Lewis gave him the payday. John Henry Lewis was going to fight again after that, couldn't get past the physical inspection, had to retire, and retired. So I think that's the story that most people know about him.
And also too, like to touch on when you said earlier that he's like completely forgotten. Keep in mind he died in what, 1974, 1975, And I don't know how much in the public he was before that. Like I don't know if he was making any appearances or going to like any Cauliflower Alley Club conventions or whatever, Ring 8 or whatever those things you want to call back then. So like who knows? And like a lot of those champions back then, you can mention him. I'll give you another example. Came a little after him, but still like Harold Dade. Remember like the Bantamweight champion? How many people would remember him today? You know what I mean? Like guys who passed away so many years ago and always kind of kept a low profile in general. They just get forgotten.
Yeah, dude, I can't off the top of my head think of too many appearances that he made or anything like that. And not to
Yeah.
say that he didn't, I don't know, but I can't think of off the top of my head too many photos I've seen or anything. But he was retired by the age of 25 with a messed up eye. He had kind of taken a number of jobs after that. I couldn't speak to how his life went. I don't know. But yeah, he died many years later. But yeah, he retired by the age of 25.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, a great fighter, absolute great fighter, Hall of Famer, and kind of a tragic, ending to his career too, because he was a great fighter who probably had more to offer. But like a lot of those guys back then, when they had injured eyes and stuff, they tried to keep that shit hidden because of like what you said. They weren't going to be allowed to fight, and how else were they going to make a living? They didn't have any pensions, they didn't have like anybody trying to offer them jobs lined up, and frankly, most of them didn't know what to do with themselves after that. So fighting is all they knew and what they were good at and what they were able to make, money at. Like, Gypsy Joe Harris. Gypsy Joe Harris, the middleweight from Philadelphia, who fought his entire career blind in one eye from an accident he sustained as a kid. Um, when they finally found out about that after his loss to Emil Griffith, he pleaded with them at the court. He was like, "Listen, please, 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 like I'm begging you, let me fight. Like, this is what I need. Like my life will fall apart literally if I don't get a chance to do this. Like this is all I know. Don't let me like, fall off of this."
Yep.
And they were like, "No, we can't allow you in good conscience," and yada 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 blah blah. And his life literally did fall apart after that. It wasn't
Yeah,
as
they
like I
did
don't
that
think
Sports
Lewis.
Illustrated cover story on it. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think John Henry Lewis had a drastic fall like Gypsy Joe Harris did. Like Harris just like he said he was going to. He fell into drugs, he fell into alcohol hard. He ended up dying at the young age of like 40 something of a heart attack. It was absolutely tragic,
Yeah, and
but
definitely looked much older than he was. Yeah.
sure. It's sad though when these things happen. Sugar Ray Seal's another one with eye injuries, so on. But another guy I wanted to bring up, we've talked about him on past shows, but since we did the Hall of Fame episode last week, and we've been talking about why isn't he on the ballot, it's still, worthy of bringing him up is Marvin Johnson. Like, don't need to spend, too much time talking about his overall career and everything because we've done that, but why isn't he on the ballot? You know what I mean? Think about it. The first three-time light heavyweight champion. The guy was through and through the absolute ringer of the same way that the rest of them did of the golden era of light heavyweights and came out relatively on top. He was still one of the top 5 or 6 best of that era, like an absolute great fighter. And when you think about it too, he was the last one standing of that entire era. Whether however you want to look at it, by the time he was still when he became champion again in 1986, when he stopped Leslie Stewart in an upset, he was still like in his early 30s. He wasn't even that old, and they were only calling him like pops and old man and stuff like that in the division. But like, you know,
To be fair,
he
he was balding a long time.
he was all right. By the time he was like in his 20s, remember that hairline he had that was already back there? But think
I
about
can relate. I understand, but yeah, it fortunately had nothing to do with him being a
it.
great fighter.
His longevity was incredible because like he had been through it. Like he was a guy that came up. He was in the 72 Olympics, I think. Yeah, 72 Olympics for America and turned pro soon after that. Became champion initially in what, 78, 79 when he beat Mate Parlov,
Hmm.
which was no easy task because Parlov is another guy that's rarely ever mentioned today, but a tough as nails dude from where was he from? The pit Croatia, right? I think.
He was he's from Croatia.
Yeah. And former amateur, top amateur, and awkward style, and just everything like that. And I want to say Johnson went to his hometown because probably he did. Parlov always kind of fought out of his own area, Yugoslavia, wherever. And he knocked him out, like stopped him in a big win. But soon after that, in his first defense, he ended up fighting his old nemesis, Saad Muhammad, and in an absolute brutal, brutal war, gets stopped in that one. No big deal, it happens. But he bounces back to end up, to knocking out Victor Galindez, the long-standing light heavyweight champion of the majority of the 70s. Not only did he knock him out, he broke his jaw. That was a nasty knockout at the end of that fight. Because if you watch, it doesn't look like it's a hard punch, Pat, right? But like he kind of jabs him, boom, boom, and then he lands that long left hand, bow, and when he hits it, you see Galindez's face instantly contort into absolute pain, like he's about to start crying. And he grabs his face and drops down and find out he got his jaw shattered. But again, Johnson, after he loses again his first defense to Eddie Mustafa Muhammad. Soon after he gets knocked out by Michael Spinks, and it looks like he's going to be the end of it. But there he is again, though, still toiling, still fighting, maybe, not being at the top of the heat, but like still hanging in there. And he still becomes champion again at 86. And at this point, too, Michael Spinks had moved up to heavyweight, so he was gone. Matthew San Muhammad, his bullet was spent a long time ago before that. Eddie Mustafa Muhammad was more or less finished. Dwight Cowie was gone and already moved up to cruiserweight. Um, Jerry the Bull Martin was finished. Like James Scott was long gone after that. Ladi Mawali, same thing. Like all these guys were gone, and here was Marvin Johnson, not only still competing but become champion again.
And on top of that, like he checks all the boxes, dude. It doesn't really make sense to me that he's not on there because it's not just a case of him being a three-time champion, and it's not just a case of him having longevity, but he was also a popular fighter, and he was also an entertaining fighter. Obviously, I can't speak to the fights I haven't seen, but according to Russell Peltz, he says that there were a handful of fights that Johnson was involved in too that were like lesser known fights that were absolute fucking wars at the Spectrum. And I mean,
Mhm.
like, I wasn't there, so I don't fucking know. But like, he was also popular in Indianapolis. He was given the key to the city, I think twice, stuff like that, which is, I mean, that's the kind of thing that like people laugh at now, but is a big deal when you get the key to the city. You fucking go around, do
Sure.
whatever the fuck you want. And like he plowed through the vast majority of a really tough light heavyweight division that we now celebrate, and a number of the fighters that are celebrated: Eddie Mustafa Muhammad, Matthew Saad Muhammad, Dwight Muhammad Qawi, primarily those three, but also Michael Spinks is the kind of like the overlap of their era or whatever. But Marvin Johnson was like was the link for a lot of these guys, and it was like he just was just a notch below, just barely in some cases. You know what I mean? And then all these other guys. But then there were the other fighters like the Galindez, the Matty Parlov, and shit like that, that were like the kind of second tier so it was like he's between that first and second tier. He's just a hair below the first tier. But he clearly showed that he could beat the second tier.
He did, and it was like by the time he gets stopped by Michael Spinks in 1981, it kind of looks like, all right, he's going to hit a dead end now because like the champions of that division, you have Eddie Mustafa Muhammad that's on top, Saad Muhammad's still on top. He lost to both of those guys. Michael Spinks is a top contender, and he just got starched against him. Even though he did good against Spinks, he was winning that fight until he got caught. You know what I mean? Like it was difficult, but that looked like that was the end. But it was that excursion that doesn't get talked about from 82 up until when he became champion again in 86. Like he went undefeated for a long time. And he beat some decent guys, if you want to look at his record right there. Like he beat Jerome Clouden, he beat Johnny Davis, he beat Eddie Davis, Prince Charles Williams. Like those were good names on his record, you know what I mean? And this is him being like the wily veteran that was supposed to be like the name that was supposed to like he was supposed to be the name for these guys' records, right? Like the old guy, the name that you add to your thing. And like to his credit, he beat them all up until when he beat Leslie Stewart. So yeah, it's kind of absurd when you look at the credentials of some of the people on the Hall of Fame ballot right now that we talked about last week on last week's episode. And then you wonder why a guy like Marvin Johnson is not on the ballot today. And Johnson would be on the old timers. That's where he would be on because his last fight was in 1987. So he would be on the modern old timers ballot, but still, he deserves his day in the sun, and I don't understand why he's not on it.
Yeah, it doesn't really make much sense, man. Especially
And he's
like you
still
said,
alive too. Like, a
yeah, the
lot of it's
longevity.
yeah. These guys are not staying around forever. They're part of that era now where like, they're starting to drop. Like Saad Muhammad's not around anymore. Um, Eddie Mustafa's a little older, but he's still there. Michael Spinks is still around, but like Victor Galindez died in 1980. Yaki Lopez is still around. But I mean, like these guys in general, they're getting older. You know what I mean? And why wait until they don't have a chance to like get a chance to appreciate themselves or whatever? Like it just doesn't make any sense.
Well, and it doesn't hold up like to scrutiny for people saying, "Oh, well, they need to get in on merit and stuff like that." And
Yeah.
then what's so and so doing in? Then what's so and so? You know what I mean? Like it doesn't hold up. So yeah, I'd really like to see somebody like Marvin Johnson at least get on that ballot and most likely get in. I don't would imagine, I can't imagine why he wouldn't. But yeah, that's a really good one for sure. No question. I was gonna bring up, since we got semi-limited time, I was gonna bring up somebody from way back again, but that's all right. We're gonna actually stick to the same era because it links up nicely, and then we could probably still have another time for to bring up another light heavyweight, and that's John Conti. Somebody that we'd mentioned, talking about the show and stuff like that, who was a really, really good fighter. Um, Unfortunately kind of somewhat relegated to the UK scene for much of his career, which, like I said, unfortunate because he ruled that scene for a minute there and probably would have done really well in the 1970s against some of these other guys a little bit earlier. But even so, did very well overall and was an incredible fighter and really popular in the UK too.
Dude, Conti was one of those guys that like he was a superstar back in the 70s for the UK. And I'm confident in saying that if like, there was like an internet age and like social media and TikTok and all that bullshit that there is, he would have been a massive crossover star in boxing today because that was just the type of personality he had. He was a really good looking guy. He was featured in magazines and parties and television all over the
Yep.
UK and America, for example, for that matter too.
Yeah, he was
He
one of those like women want him, men want to be him type of guys.
Totally. Absolutely. And he looked the part too. He would do like the photo shoots where he was wearing like the Superman t-shirt and like posing and all the thing. And correct me if I'm wrong, he won that competition on ABC or like one of the networks, right? For like the overall sports competition. Like
I
they had to go against other athletes from
Yeah,
different
it's
states, right?
Battle of the Network Stars
Some shit like that.
or
Yeah, yeah,
whatever.
yeah. And he won that, which, gained him some notoriety as well. But on top of all of that, you can have all the glitz and glamour and the looks and everything. At the bottom line is you need to back it up by fighting. We've seen a lot of flashes in the pan that look the part and they talk it, but they don't really be able to back it up. And Conti, to his credit, was able to back it up. He was a bad man in the ring. He was a classic, absolute classic stand-up fighter. Had good reflexes, a beautiful jab, combinations, had good power, not great power, but good power, and just knew how to fight. And initially, he was going to start out as a heavyweight. Like, he fought at heavyweights early on, and like he did have a few fights where he was like appearing with Muhammad Ali and such. And I forgot what fight it was, but I think he fought on the Ali undercard. And after he did, he look bringing up his record right here to see when it might have been. Let's see. Uh, Fought Terry Daniels. So yeah, all right. He fought on the undercard of Ali Bugner in 1973, and he fought former Joe Frazier opponent Terry Daniels. And he stops him, but after he stopped him, he talked to Ali afterwards, and it was like, what do you think? And blah blah blah. And Ali was like, "You're not a heavyweight." He just straight up told him, he was like, "You're not a heavyweight. You need to move down or do something." And Conti was like, "Well, okay." Like he wasn't even mad about it or like, take an insult to it or nothing. He was like, "All right, I think he's just being honest with me." And so he went down the light heavyweight, and that's where he really flourished.
Well, and he didn't he was not a heavyweight,
Yeah,
and he wasn't heavyweight sized either. Like at 6 foot, that seems to be about like the cutoff, roughly. You know what I mean? Like you get below 6 foot and like above a certain weight, it's kind of like, all right, you're gonna be struggling. Like you're gonna be reaching, you're gonna be jumping, leaping. You need to get in close, and your options are limited for sure. And Muhammad Ali himself was not a massive heavyweight, but he was a big enough heavyweight that if you're 6 foot, 185 pounds, you're too small to take on Muhammad Ali, generally speaking. So, I mean, yeah, that makes sense to me. And, but like you said, he moved down and he showed what's what. And a number of the guys that he wound up defeating as a light heavyweight, as the British and European light heavyweight champion, were guys who themselves were also very popular on the UK scene. Chris Finnegan was a guy who was really popular at light heavyweight in the UK, but also Tom Boggs, another dude who was I'm pretty sure he was not British. I want to say he was like Danish or something like that. Now I'm
yeah.
about to look. Yeah, okay. Oh wow, I actually got one right for a sec for a change. But yeah, Yaki Lopez, Len Hutchins, Matty Parloff lost the decision there, but it was a super close fight. Parloff had a handful of close fights. But I mean, this was like the upper level that Conti was able to show himself against.
Sure. And when he became champion in 74, he won the vacant title against Jorge Ahumada. And Ahumada like looked incredible against, obviously it was a spent bullet in Bob Foster, but still, of all the guys that was able to, he got definitely robbed in a draw that he should have won in Albuquerque. So by the time he fights Conti, like, I'm not going to say Ahumada was the favorite in that fight. I'm not entirely sure, but he had the momentum going into that, but Conti shined and scored a very convincing decision. Like he whooped him in that one, and that's what made him look like he was going to be the star of that division. But we soon found out, man. Even though he was a great fighter, Conti was in terms of skill and overall, like how he alluded to earlier, he was really personable and featured all the time on television and in magazines and this and that. He was heavily into the nightlife. You know what I mean? He so again, I wonder how social media would have made it for him back then because how guys in social media today, like Broner and others, have just taken that to the extreme and been just absolute idiots with it. But Conti, to his own admission too, after his career ended, he had a drinking problem. He had a partying problem. He just, he lived it up. If he was popular with the women, like you said, he was popular all around. Everyone wanted to hang out with him. Everyone wanted to be around him, and he indulged. And so like he's burning the candle at both ends. And when you do that, your career is never gonna like, work out well enough. It's just eventually it's gonna crash and burn. And that's what his kind of did. Like, he gives up the WBC title before, for whatever reason, he doesn't end up fighting Coelho. I'm not gonna say he was scared of him because that definitely wasn't the case. It was just probably over some, politics or man, whatever it might have been. So he gives up the belt, but then he fights, like you said, Mate Parlov, and he loses a really, really close decision in a fight that could have gone either way. But once that happens, he's kind of struggling now, and now come to find out that's because of what he was going through in his life. He fights a draw with Jesse Burnett, and but he still has a big enough name that he gets to fight, now the recent champion Matthew Saad Muhammad in Atlantic City in '79. And I mean, this is a very memorable fight for a number of reasons. So,
Yeah, well, Saad Muhammad had a whole bunch of memorable fights, but this was one of them.
sure.
And I mean, this was a fight where Conti fought his ass off too, and it was just an occasion where Saad Muhammad wound up being another occasion where Saad Muhammad wound up being just a bit too much man for an opponent. But he also got a favorable kind of shake, and this was during a time when, man, like this was kind of like the slightly pre-steroid era, and so the sanctioning organizations were still trying to figure out what exactly to do with some of these instances where substances were being used. And you also have to remember, not to excuse anybody, but there were a lot of holdovers from the 50s, 60s or so, when we've talked on other shows, where you were allowed to mix whatever the fuck you wanted basically and bring it in your little fucking bag ringside and apply it to your fighter's face or whatever between rounds. Smelling salts, whatever, like you could anticoagulants, all sorts of shit, and fucking and or coagulants, all sorts of shit. And so basically what wound up happening was that one of the cut men, I think it was Adolf Ritaco, I believe, uh, who was a really, really well-known cut man for hire around Philadelphia. And I'm pretty sure it was him who wound up getting caught using some fucking weird substance to prevent Saad Muhammad's eye from bleeding and swelling between rounds, and then got caught afterward. The WBC declared the fight a no contest, but the New Jersey Commission refused to declare the fight a no contest, and so the WBC ordered a rematch. And it was like, as you can imagine, uh, gonna kind of needle the UK fans for a moment here. They've been whining and crying and bleeding about the fucking Muhammad Ali versus Henry Cooper first fight, and how Ali was gifted 19 straight minutes in his corner because of the glove, when in reality it was like 20 seconds or something like that. But they're still crying about that. And similarly, because of the controversy with the coagulant substance in the corner, a number of British publications were like, fuck, this is what happened in Atlantic City. You bring a British fighter to Atlantic City, they're going to fuck you over. And so that's kind of what wound up happening. And they kind of whooped John Conti into a frenzy, like, oh, he's going to get revenge for this fucking, you got wronged. And then he went in and got stomped in a rematch, unfortunately.
It's Conti. I'm gonna put that fight, the first fight, like, you ever have it, Pat, where like, sometimes in a fight where a champion ends up putting on a more inspired performance than they used to, right? Like just something like really out of the ordinary, and they should have got the fight. You know what I mean? Like, and they end up getting robbed because of it. Well, like, it's close enough that after when the scores are read, you're kind of like, wait, what the fuck? And that, how you're trying to think to yourself, how did these judges come to this point? Because it makes absolutely no sense. And like perfect example would be the first fight between Paul Yael and Bones Adams, right? Like Bones Adams,
Yeah, that
see,
was robbery of the year. Fucking
it
yeah.
was, right? Bones Adams, I have not watched that fight in years, but from what I remember, he put a whooping on Yael, and most people agreed with it. Like
Ayala
he
got like
fought a
six
very
different decisions that he didn't deserve, dude. So
sure.
anyway,
Yeah,
sorry.
he's on the ballot too. But Bones Adams put on a very inspired fight that night, and definitely should have won it. And you almost feel like after he lost that, it took something out of him, because in the rematch he was just completely deflated, and he just got outworked and outboxed and beat up and whatever. And you almost get the same sense with this fight too, because not only was it extremely close, look at the scorecards right here for their first fight. It was 141, 146, which is probably, excuse me, a little wide. 142, 146, and 143, 144, which is probably closer to what it was.
Yeah.
Conti got dropped near the end, didn't he? And I think that's what saved Sod.
Yeah, I want to say it was like around 12 or something like that. I'd have to look,
Yeah.
but something like that.
But not only that, though, like you said, they used some crazy shit back then on Saad's eyes that were completely illegal. And rightfully so, too, because the stuff what we've discussed that too with like cornermen and cutmen back then, they were coming up with their own concoctions of crap that
Yeah,
they would
who
carry
knows
on.
what kind of fucking cocaine and heroin was in that shit.
I mean, the little doctor bags, the Fugazi doctor bags, they would be carrying around there. That no one would check or anything or even like question what they were doing. And they'd be walking around, they'd have two like giant Q-tips in their mouth, things over their ears, over this thing, that, all that type of shit. And they would just be going in there and grabbing different colored stuff, sometimes green, sometimes kind of charcoalish, whatever, white powder, something mystery looking, and just fluttering on there. And probably creating some gnarly ass scar tissue from it too, because it has no business being on your skin. That's what they used on the side. And that was one of the last instances of like the old guard using crazy concoctions before they were like completely stopped because they were like, bro, what are you doing? Even though this is 1979, we're talking over 40 something years now. It's like they noticed that back then we're like, okay, we cannot be doing this. This is not the 30s and 40s. You cannot just come in here with your little goodie bags of crap and
Yeah.
just like,
It's when they started clamping down on shit in general, though. You know what I'm saying? Because this was right around the same time where you couldn't fight under a pseudonym anymore. Like up
oh yeah,
until like the 1970s, like you could fight under fucking Killer Bee or, fucking Doctor fucking Death or some shit. But
sure,
then
sure.
after that, they're like, no, bro, you're going under fucking Nate McDonald. Like you're fighting under fucking John fucking Lewis or something. Like that's it. So so I get it. They're stretching. They're trying to figure out how to do shit. But yeah, that was one of the big reasons why that first fight was controversial.
Totally. But by that rematch, like I mentioned with the Bones Adam thing, you can totally see he was off then, right?
Yeah,
It
that
was
was his
really off
chance.
then. That was it. And that was one of Saad Muhammad's probably his easiest defense when it came down to it, because Conti offered absolutely no resistance in that fight. And he even said it to in an interview subsequently afterwards. He had nothing, he was gone. His mind wasn't there anymore, nothing was there anymore. And like Saad beat him up. And the close-up photos, because there are some really great photos from both the first and second fight. I think the first fight when Conti's like laid up and like he really hurt and Saad standing over him. But then the second one too, where it's like Conti's sitting on the canvas and he almost has that same stairway fade that Alexis Arguello had in the second prior fight, or what Eric Morales had in the Pacquiao fight. Which one was it?
Yeah.
Like the third one or something?
Yeah, where he's just kind of like, yeah, that's it.
Yeah, that's it. Like I'm not here. I can't do this tonight. Yeah.
Which can't blame him, especially not against Matthew Saad Muhammad. Get knocked down and you see that dude standing there, I'd probably be like, yeah, I'm good. I,
And at
I'll
that
I'll take
point
my
too, like
check.
he knew it was going to happen. Like Saad was not spent at this time. He was definitely amped up for the rematch of this one, and it is what it is. But I mean, for a guy as popular as Conti was, he was a really popular guy, and like he got a lot done in a short career. I feel like he could have got more done, but like you said, he had out of the ring issues that definitely hampered in his career in that matter. But for what it's worth, again, I'm surprised he isn't on the ballot or even considered for that.
I mean, considering especially a lot of it comes down to a popularity contest, but he's got, like I said on the show last week, he's got one of the major things working against him. He's not American.
Yeah. And his career ended 44 years ago.
Yeah, I mean that's not helpful in terms of memory. Yeah, then only sickos like us are fucking breaking down his career and shit like that.
I
But
mean, it's really not even that long ago, man. Like, all we're asking is for people just to do their due diligence and their research if you're going to vote. Like, that's the bare minimum.
you'd think that that's a really reasonable expectation, but when you say things like that, I'm actually a little surprised that when I said some shit on Twitter that nobody was really pushing back. Because in other years when I've said things, people have been like, "Who the fuck are you?" And whatever, I don't give a fuck. But I mean, still, it's like eh, some of these people, I don't know what they're doing. Whatever. I'm not going to go into it, but I don't know what they're doing.
Totally. We have time for one more now.
Yeah, let's do another quick entry.
Quick one. He's an all-time great fighter. and someone we both love, but his light heavyweight reign was short but also brutal. Dick Tiger.
That's true, man. Yeah, Dick Tiger, just another a fighter who I think that because of his physique and because of the way that he looked, the assumption would be like, oh, he's a monster, he's a big puncher and stuff like that. When he wasn't really, that wasn't his style. It was just that he was going to marathon your ass all night.
And strong as shit too. Like he wasn't, like you said, a one punch knockout artist, but there was
Mhm.
nobody that had the pure strength that Tiger did. Like, ask any of the middleweights from back in the day that fought him, like whether it come, for instance, Ruben Hurricane Carter. How many people backed Carter up? Carter was a rampaging machine that just came in there and either blew you out, or if you were able to outbox him, he was on your ass the whole fight, like, on your chest and just breathing on you and just brutalizing you. And Tiger dropped him, beat him up, and backed him up the whole fight. And Carter said no one was able. Carter was like, I couldn't do a thing to him. He was like, he was an absolute tank. Florentino Fernandez, same thing. Any other fighter, like Tiger was one of the most like physically strong guys you ever saw. Like, but he didn't like put that type of pressure on you where he needed. Like, it was intelligent pressure. He didn't just come in and just maul you and put his head on you and just grind away and everything. Like, there was always a reason for what he did. He was a good boxer, just really competent boxer, but the only way to beat him was to outbox him. You know what I mean? Especially at middleweight. Like, you were not going to stand toe to toe with Dick Tiger and try to outslug him. It wasn't going to work. You weren't going to go over there and try to, like, outwill him. It wasn't going to work. Like, he had already shown that he was going to break anybody, because look what he did to a guy like Ruben Hurricane Carter. And look what he did to Gene Fullmer. Fullmer fought him 3 times. Fullmer is one of the strongest, most brute strength champions in history, let alone just middleweight. Just a guy that was just rugged and strong and couldn't really do much with him. And Tiger toyed with him. Well, especially in their third fight. I mean, now I'm not going to say toyed with him in terms of like, he made Fulmer look foolish, but I mean, like, he toyed with him in terms of like just the strength of how he wanted to body him around. Like, Fulmer couldn't do shit to him either. Tiger was an anomaly.
Yeah, and in that third fight, he beat his ass under what basically looked like a shed in Nigeria. And I'm
Nigeria.
not trying to like talk shit, but like you look at the photos and it's literally just like a cheap ass corrugated roof like covering this joint. And yeah, he Fulmer just looks thoroughly beaten up in the photos from the fight. But and then on top of that, not too long after that third fight, he beat Fulmer's brother's ass, Don Fulmer. Yeah, he just went through his family. Um, yeah, dude, I think that especially because when you take into account, like I said, that he wasn't a big puncher and that a lot of it was just that he was strong and that he worked. Man, he was an imposing fighter to go in against, and he has a really impressive resume. Like just the names on his resume, even the ones he lost to, just going down name, all over.
And a lot of those guys too, like Tiger's early career, when you look at some of them, you're like, oh man, he had this many losses or whatever. A lot of those losses early on in his career are very questionable because of how he came up. And some of them they found out, yeah, they were like against him, or he had to throw them, or some shit happened because of just the circumstances of how he came up. But when he was allowed to have free reign and like he wasn't essentially handcuffed anymore, all bets were off and he just tore everyone's ass up. And one thing about him too that I kind of love is that he was one of the fighters who was like during the 60s when organized crime was still had a hold on boxing, but it was loosening its grip, right? With like Carbo and the rest of these guys. But boxing in general was still reeling from all of that in the sport because the fucking what is that Kavafer meeting? How do you say the word?
K favor, yeah.
Yeah, K favor. Yeah, so like, the K favor hearings that was all over television and all these other things going on. Boxing was struggling, it was struggling a lot. But Tiger was one of the mainstays at MSG. Even though MSG boxing was struggling during the 60s and having some issues or whatever, Tiger was one of the holdovers that anytime he fought there, he was going to be a popular attraction. That was like his home base. Tiger fought as MSG almost as much as Floyd Mayweather would fight at the MGM Grand. Like one of those guys, but he brought in the crowds. It didn't matter. He would just bring in the crowds and he always delivered and he fought a who's who. There was not a guy that Tiger was not willing to fight back then. And he would fight them over and over. And that's what makes his resume absolutely ridiculous because you look at it, Joey Giardello, Ruben Carter, Rocky Rivera, Juan Carlos Rivera, Joey Archer. Who the fuck wanted to fight Joey Archer back then? Um, Jose Gonzalez, who was an absolute rugged machine fighter back then. Like we said, Gene Fullmer, Florentino Fernandez, Spider Webb, like, bro, Wilfie Greaves. These dudes, these are all badass fighters, man. Like the toughest fighters you can imagine from the 60s. And Tiger was beating the majority of them. Sometimes dropping a loss in here and there, but he was winning more than he was losing.
Yeah, there was a dude named Tony Vero who brought Tiger to the UK or helped
Mhm.
secure fights for Tiger in the UK. And that's kind of where he really, cut his teeth or got a lot of experience. But by the time he had gotten to the US and, spent a lot of his time in the US, he was definitely a different fighter. Like you talk about his early losses and stuff like that. Some of them even are to fighters like Ellsworth Spider Webb, who was an extremely competent, if not very good, middleweight in the 1960s. But you brought up also the kayfabe hearings and stuff like that. That was during their late 1950s and early 1960s, where they were doing a lot of investigations into organized crime. Like, for
Mhm.
instance, if anybody's ever seen the movie Hoffa with Jack Nicholson, they do a big scene with the dude who's playing RFK, who's, sitting Hoffa down and grilling him and shit like that. They did the same type of shit to a lot of promoters, a lot of boxing figures. But in any case, also another thing that I always found really interesting about Dick Tiger was his connection to the country of Biafra, which was a kind of a rogue nation, if you will, that broke off from Nigeria in the 1960s and claimed and declared its independence from Nigeria. And I mean, there's an entire like history behind it. I'm not going to go into it. We don't have time, but nonetheless, he was one of the more famous people who was championing the independence of this West African country and joined the Biafran army during his career. So I mean, you know, that's significant. I mean, I always found it really interesting anyway. But
Kind of similar to like Arguello and the stuff he was going through in Nicaragua back in the day.
totally, yeah. And there was also a lot of kind of weird, shady shit similar to with Arguello and his political career too. But anyway, very interesting. And right around the same time that he had gotten taken out by Bob Foster too.
Sure. And that's the thing too, is that after he loses the middleweight title to Emil Griffith in 1966, Griffith had one of those styles that was going to give Tiger fits because like Griffith was light on his feet and he knew how to box and you can flurry and just, Tiger wasn't the fastest guy on his feet either. So like if you were able to outbox him and keep away from him, you had a chance to beat him. That's how Joey Archer was able to skirt by him. That's how Giardello was able to beat him to win the championship and so on. But like, and that's what he was able to just that's what Griffith did. Also, Griffith had a style that just was like kryptonite for Tiger. But anyways, when he moved up in 1967 now, Tiger has been a pro for a long ass time and he's kind of thought about being on the back end. And so when Jose Torres defends against him, Jose Torres now, the popular champion who had beat Willie Pastrano, he'd been under Cus D'Amato's rule and yada yada yada, really popular fighter at that point. He was not expected to beat Jose Torres. Hence why probably Cus D'Amato must have been so enthusiastic to take the fight because he thought it might have been a safe bet. But Tiger was still one of those dudes, man. Like he was able to put it together and put on a competent performance where he outboxed him, outslugged him when he needed to. And Torres was not a guy that was like fleet of foot. He fought kind of like in the whole peekaboo style. So he'd be playing into Tiger a little bit and trying to like bully him and body him. And you're not going to do that, especially now that Tiger's not going to be hampered to making 160. He was able to do what he had to do. And so he outboxed him and he beat him. And Tiger's reign is like, his late career when you look at it is like incredibly impressive too. Sure, like he beats Torres twice, and he also beat Roger Rouse, who was a competent contender back then, before he gets decapitated by Foster. And sure, no big deal losing to Foster. I mean, he was competitive in that fight too before he finally got caught by that whirlwind hook. He tagged Foster a couple of times. Well, even at one time you see Foster shake a little bit when he hits him, like he was getting in on him and he had an idea. He just knew that like eventually some dumb shit was gonna happen. And well, when Foster threw that fucking hook from Albuquerque all the way to MSG, you know,
Yeah, dude.
that
And
would take
then
down a tower. That would take down a building, let alone poor Tiger.
yeah, like he got flattened and his head hit the canvas so hard, dude. Like
People
it's
thought he was
amazing that
dead.
he even went on to fight at all after that.
Sure. And his very next fight after that was against a guy named Frankie DuPaula, who was a wild slugger and a very popular fighter. Not a very good boxer, but a guy that hit really hard. And Tiger got dropped twice. went on. I don't think the fight's filmed either, which is unfortunate, but it was such a wild affair that it was the Ring Magazine's fight of the year. And people that witnessed it and like people that wrote about it that, witnessed it back then swore by it, saying it was one of the most incredible fights you could have seen. But one of his most underrated wins and one of his best wins is after that is when he beat the current champion, Nino Benvenuti.
Yep, he beat Nino Benvenuti and, did it under well, kind of underdog circumstances, obviously, because he's old and just got knocked out real bad by Bob Foster like the year earlier. So there were a lot of questions about whether or not, he's still even a viable contender. But, Nino Benvenuti, as great as he was, not talking shit, he could run hot and cold and he could come into fights and basically like afterward be like, yeah, I wasn't really that motivated and stuff like
Mm.
that. And I think that was, again, not making excuses, but Dick Tiger stepped up and got the win. And then on top of that, defeated another contender who was a very competent contender in Andy Kendall.
Sure. And I gotta wonder too, Tiger might have been suffering already the beginning effects of a, liver cancer that eventually killed him. Um,
He might have.
yeah. Because this all happened in 1969. He loses the Emil Griffith at 70 and he dies what year?
It was like the
Liver
year
cancer.
after or something like that. I mean, he wasn't old. Yeah, it was 1971.
Oh yeah, December of 71. So, it's possible that he could have been. I know that people said that he was probably already showing the signs in the Griffith fight at that point because like the way he was moving, he was slow and sluggish, and I think he even said that he just knew something was off with him in that one. But
Yeah, and I've heard people say stuff like he had already like his like the whites of his eyes were already yellow and I don't know if that's true. I have no idea. But I've read that. But if that is the case, then Jesus Christ.
sure.
It's like fucking Peter Jackson fighting in the early stages of tuberculosis or whatever. Jesus
But
Christ.
now the Nino Benvenuti one is like huge because like that would still be like big today. And any type of era, if something like that were to happen, people like, holy shit. Benvenuti was 78 and 2. He was the middleweight champion, like superior at that point of the division. And yeah, I think he was already I think he was probably already a little past it too because Munzon would beat him the next year and, essentially finish him. But that being said, like you said, man, no one thought that Tiger was supposed to win that fight. That was supposed to be like a non-title Benvenuti just get a decision over former champion. And Tiger was still able to turn it on. Just an absolute great fighter. Just a great, great fighter. You know what I mean? And a good human too. Just like you touched on about like, the stuff that he was going through with his country and how he joined the Biafran army and so on and so forth and stuff like that. Like just a fascinating person. I'm surprised. Is there any books and stuff? I think there are books written on him, but I don't think they were like widely like sold
Gosh.
in America or anything.
I'm not really sure, to be honest. There probably are, but
Yeah.
I don't really know. But dude, there's like, I'm a member of I've mentioned this before, a couple of like boxing book groups on Facebook where like there's some people who have like entire rooms full of books, and they'll be like, "Have you heard of this?" No, never even know who that fighter is. What do you mean? And there's a
Sure.
book written about him. Well, Dick Tiger missed just by a few years becoming the first Nigerian world champion. Hogan Kid Bassi won that distinction in the 1950s, but he didn't miss it by too much. But nonetheless, he definitely proved to be greater than Kid Bassi. No disrespect to Kid Bassi, of course, but Dick Tiger was just very great champion.
Well, yeah, when Ring Magazine in the 90s, remember how they would do like the best by either the nation or the best of country, like their top 10? I want to say they didn't because they didn't try to like single out countries the best of Ghana, best of this one, that one because honestly you can't make a top 10 list of those type of things. It's kind of difficult, right? So they did like top 10 best of Africa, which like you said earlier, people were like, oh, you can't do that, but for a list like this, I guess sometimes you can do that. You know what I mean?
It's a double-edged sword because I 100% agree with and understand the criticism, but we're also given a far, smaller breadth of knowledge to work with. And that's our
Absolutely.
bad, but we're doing what we can. We're trying to recognize who we can.
Uh, Dick Tiger was rated number one from the best of the that continent.
I'd go with Azuma Nelson, but I that's cool.
Yeah. Yeah, Tiger was number one. I want to say Nelson was number two or so, but like, you know,
Sure. like it's all good. But
He was just
clearly,
a cool ass
great
dude, and
champion.
he spoke very limited English. I mean, he was kind of a very quiet guy and solemn, whatever. But it's not on the end. I don't think it's on YouTube anymore, which is too bad. But remember that show? There are clips of like other former champions on it from like the 50s and 60s, it, where they would have these three like three celebrities or three people, the panel people over there, and they have to guess who the person is by getting
Yeah, yeah,
clues.
yeah. It's like who am I or what's
Something
my
like that.
line
Yeah,
or
yeah, yeah. Some one of those shows,
some
whatever it
shit.
is.
Yeah, one of those things.
And they were just giving him by his real name, Richard Ateyu. They weren't saying Dick Tiger. They were just like, so Mr. Ateyu, you're in a profession. Do you do sports? Yes. Okay. Do you do blah 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 blah? No. Like, they're trying to figure out finally at the end of it, someone was like, are you a professional boxer? And he said, yeah. And they were like, and then the host was like, well, yes, not only is he a professional boxer, he's the middweight champion of the world. He goes by the name Dick Tiger. And then like two of the people on the panel like, oh, I've heard of him. And they start clapping.
They just didn't know his real name.
Yeah, exactly. And he was wearing like a ceremonial garb with a hat. He looked cool as shit. Like he looked really cool.
Yeah, it's too bad that he didn't survive longer because he would have been somebody cool as hell to get some stories from.
Oh man, I'm sure he would have went to the Hall of Fame had he lived because he was around that age and he definitely would have been around then. So
I feel like we got through a lot of really good and underrated, unsung, forgotten about light heavyweights and some others too.
sure,
I feel like
absolutely.
it was a good spread.
Yes, sir. I enjoyed this.
I appreciate that, man. Hey, dude, I hope this weekend's good. Ultimately, I hope everybody's safe. I hope we have a good time. I hope it's a good fight. I hope we get some clarity as far as figuring out who the greatest light heavyweight of today is. And I hope everybody enjoyed the show.
Same.
All right, everybody. Thanks so much. Thank you, Eris. But thank everybody who listened in. We appreciate you. Go ahead and subscribe on those podcast apps. Give us a rating, comment. And as far as YouTube, same, 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 same. Subscribe, comment, etc. Social media, same, 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 same. All right, Eris. Talk soon, bro.
Have a good one, yo.